let's slow things down. You don't have to listen too closely, just let your mind wander while we talk about something incredibly unimportant. If you're enjoying these sleep stories, feel free to give us a like or subscribe, but no pressure at all. Now, let's start our journey. If you were a Victorian, you'd probably be more worried about perfecting your curtsy than crafting a killer Instagram bio. Welcome to the world of rigid social rules, where the stakes of a social faux pas could make a scandal headline out of your garden party. In the mid-19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, society became a well-oiled machine of its own, churning out expectations faster than you could say, tea time. The year is 1837, and industrialization is reshaping everything from how you work to how you walk into a room. Thanks to all the steam engines and textile mills popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, the Victorian era is charging ahead. The economy's booming, cities are growing, and so is the pressure to fit into a polished mould of manners and morals. You see, with progress comes the need to differentiate the dignified from the riffraff. Enter the Victorian Etiquette Manual. Yes, these were real, and they were the social GPS of the day, guiding you through the convoluted maze of societal expectations. Now, let's talk about one of the quirkiest of these rules, the 12-step guide to introductions. Forget OA meetings. This is the real dance of social sobriety. Step 1. Approach with a calm demeanour, because showing enthusiasm is so dreadfully common. Step 2. A proper bow or curtsy. None of this casual nodding nonsense. By step 3, you're making eye contact. Not too much, though, lest you seem forward. And on it goes, each step a delicate pirouette on the tightrope of respectability. Skip a step, or, heaven forbid, invent your own? You'd better be prepared for the social equivalent of being exiled to Siberia. But why all the fuss? Well, in a rapidly changing world, social rules were a security blanket for the upper and middle classes. They were a way to maintain order and hierarchy when steam engines were outpacing horses and workers were moving to cities faster than you could say industrial boom. These etiquette protocols were the velvet ropes of society, keeping the riffraff out and ensuring that everyone knew their place. Ironically, the very industrialization that necessitated these rules also made life far more chaotic. Factories ran on strict schedules, demanding punctuality and precision. Trains became the new way to travel, but miss one, and you'd miss your carefully orchestrated dinner plans. Time was of the essence, which might explain why there were so many rules about it. Take dinner, for example. It wasn't just a meal, it was a 4-hour affair, with each course an opportunity to display your mastery of decorum. Heaven help you if you used the fish fork for the salad. While the upper crust was busy perfecting their social choreography, the working class had its own set of unwritten rules, more about survival than etiquette. Long working hours and low wages meant that the pleasantries of a 12-step introduction were about as relevant as a chocolate teapot. The average factory worker was dealing with a 12-hour shift, not a 12-step anything. But the allure of those polished manners remained strong, a tantalizing glimpse of a world where appearances mattered more than one's grueling reality. Now, let's bust a myth. Victorian society wasn't just about stiff upper lips and starched collars. It was also a time of profound change and innovation. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased the marvels of industrial progress in the Crystal Palace, a glittering greenhouse of innovation. Prince Albert's vision gathered over 13,000 exhibits from across the world, and it was a hit with over 6 million visitors. But even at this celebration of progress, social rules held sway. Attendees had to adhere to a strict dress code, lest they offend the sensibilities of their more refined peers. And then there were the contradictions. While society demanded propriety, it was also a time of great social reform. Figures like Florence Nightingale and Charles Dickens emerged, challenging the status quo and highlighting the dire need for compassion amid the rank and file. These reformers poked holes in the fabric of the era's social mores, revealing the threads of humanity beneath the veneer of propriety. So, as you navigate this world, remember that the Victorian obsession with etiquette was not just about maintaining appearances. It was about holding on to a semblance of control in a world that was hurtling forward at breakneck speed. It was about drawing lines in the sand, even as the industrial tide threatened to wash them away. And while you might chuckle at the absurdity of a 12-step introduction, Spare a thought for those who dance this delicate waltz of society, all in the name of keeping up appearances. Speaking of keeping up appearances, let's talk about the Victorian economy, where wealth wasn't just a privilege, it was practically a full-time job. If you were rolling in the dough, your bank account was your social resume. And boy, did it need to be impressive. Picture this. In 1850, a corset set you back about 2, which today translates to around $2.50. Yep, that's a small fortune just to squeeze your ribs into a fashionable vise. But fashion wasn't merely about looking good. It was a status symbol, a way to signal to the world that you belonged to the upper echelons of society. Now, let's dive into the dinner party circuit, because what's social life without a little culinary one-upmanship? Hosting a dinner wasn't just about feeding people, it was an art form, a strategic display of opulence. Think of it as the Victorian version of a Michelin star restaurant. If you could pull it off, you were in. The table had to be laden with the finest foods, often imported from the far corners of the British Empire. A typical soirée could easily drain you of 30, equivalent to nearly 3,750 today. And let's not forget the staff required to orchestrate such an event, cooks, footmen and maids, all at your beck and call, ensuring the soufflé didn't collapse along with your social standing. But here's the kicker. While the upper crust was busy flexing their financial muscles, the lower classes were just trying to keep their heads above water. For them, wealth was as elusive as a foggy London morning. The Industrial Revolution may have been a boon for some, but for the average factory worker it meant grueling hours and meagre pay. Imagine working 14-hour days in a factory for a pittance, while your betters worried about the correct pronunciation of scone. And yet, the allure of the upper class was undeniable. Even the poorest Victorian aspired to a slice of that genteel pie, often going to great lengths to mimic the rituals of their wealthy counterparts, albeit on a shoestring budget. This brings us to the fascinating world of thrift and ingenuity that defined working-class life. When it came to fashion, for instance, second-hand markets were the go-to for those who couldn't afford the latest French silks. These bustling bazaars were brimming with cast-offs from the wealthy, providing a treasure trove for the economically challenged to dress the part. You might snag a slightly worn frock for a fraction of its original price, allowing you to keep up appearances without bankrupting yourself. And let's not overlook the art of the makeshift dinner party, where creativity reigned supreme. A simple stew could be elevated with a few strategic herbs and spices, turning a humble meal into a feast fit for a queen, or at least fit for the neighbours. If you didn't have your own cook, your culinary skills were your ticket to social acceptance, a way to flex your resourcefulness rather than your wallet. But it wasn't just about personal appearances. Victorian society was rife with organisations and clubs designed to project an image of collective prosperity and moral superiority. For a modest fee, you could join a mutual aid society, which functioned like a primitive insurance policy. These clubs provided a financial safety net for their members, helping with costs like funerals and medical care. The irony? While these societies were a lifeline for many, they also reinforced the very class distinctions they sought to alleviate. After all, nothing says, "We're all in this together," like a tiered membership system. Now, let's debunk a persistent myth, the idea that Victorians were all about restraint and moderation. Sure, there was plenty of moral posturing about the virtues of thrift and sobriety, but let's not kid ourselves. Extravagance was the name of the game. The wealthy flaunted their riches with abandon, while the poor often found themselves pawning their few valuables to make ends meet. It was a society of stark contrasts, where the glitter of opulence often masked the grime of poverty. Yet, amid the contradictions and complexities, there was a certain romanticism to it all. The Victorian era was a time of grand ambitions and even grander illusions. It was a world where appearances mattered, not just for the sake of vanity, but as a way to navigate a rapidly changing landscape. So, as you lace up those metaphorical corsets and prepare to host your own imaginary dinner parties, remember that the Victorians were masters of the delicate dance between reality and perception. They knew that while money couldn't buy happiness, it could certainly buy a very convincing imitation. And in a society obsessed with keeping up appearances, sometimes that was more than enough. Speaking of imitations, let's dive right into the world of Victorian gender dynamics, where roles were as rigid as the starched collars of the era. Imagine living in a society where your potential was defined by your gender, and the idea of staying in your lanes was less a suggestion and more a legally binding directive. Victorian society was all about these separate spheres. Men handled public life, while women managed the private, domestic sphere. It was like a societal version of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, but without the option of a peaceful interplanetary exchange. For men, the world was their oyster, or at least it was if they had the right family connections and enough pounds in the bank. They were expected to be the breadwinners, the decision-makers, and the ones who ventured into the cutthroat world of commerce and politics. And sure, that sounds empowering, but it also came with its own brand of shackles. The pressure to succeed was immense. Failing to provide for your family was akin to social suicide, a fate worse than being caught with the wrong cutlery at a dinner party. Women, on the other hand, were groomed from a young age to be the queens of their domestic castles. Their education was often more about perfecting the art of embroidery and less about understanding the intricacies of algebra. It wasn't that women were encouraged to be unintelligent, far from it. They were expected to be the moral compass of the home, the gentle hand guiding their husbands and children. But this role had its own strict parameters. Think of it as being the CEO of a very small, very specific company, where your duties included everything from overseeing household staff to orchestrating perfect social gatherings. Now, let's tackle the romanticized myth of the Victorian courtship, where love was supposedly as pure as the driven snow and as predictable as a Jane Austen plotline. In reality, the Victorian approach to romance was more like a strategic game of chess, with love as the end game and your social standing as the board. Enter the infamous calling card system, the Tinder of its day, but with far more hoops to jump through and decidedly fewer swipes. Imagine you're a young Victorian woman. Your romantic future begins with the exchange of these little pieces of cardboard calling cards. If a gentleman was interested, he'd leave his card at your home. If you were equally interested, and your parents approved, you'd return the favour by allowing him to visit for a supervised chat, often in the family parlour. This wasn't just about flirtation, it was a carefully orchestrated dance where every move was scrutinised by society's ever-watchful eye. The calling card system was essentially a way to vet potential suitors without having to actually interact with them too much. It was slow, deliberate, and, quite frankly, exhausting. But hey, no one ever said Victorian romance was for the faint-hearted. Diaries from the era reveal the emotionally draining nature of this process. In one such diary, a young woman lamented, "I feel like a prisoner of my own heart, my feelings trapped within the confines of my family's expectations." And yet, the allure of a well-matched marriage was enough to make many endure this social labyrinth. But marriage, once achieved, wasn't always the fairy tale it was cracked up to be. Victorian ideals romanticized the notion of the angel in the house, a term popularized by Coventry Patmore's poem, where women were expected to be passive, devoted, and endlessly forgiving. In reality, many women found themselves trapped in marriages that were less about mutual affection and more about economic necessity. A letter from one disillusioned Victorian wife captured the frustration succinctly. "I am but a shadow in my own home, my thoughts and desires as invisible as the wind." Despite the oppressive nature of these roles, it's important to acknowledge the strength and resilience of Victorian women. Many found ways to assert their independence, often through social reform or writing. Figures like Elizabeth Gaskell and George Eliot used their pens to challenge societal norms, proving that while they might have been confined by their roles, they were far from powerless. Their stories serve as a reminder that even within the confines of rigid social structures, there was room for resistance and change. And let's not forget the men who felt stifled by their own roles. The pressure to conform to the ideal of the stoic, unemotional provider took a toll. Letters and diaries from the era reveal the internal struggle many faced, torn between societal expectations and their own desires for more emotionally fulfilling lives. One young man wrote to his friend, "I long for a world where I can speak of my heart without fear of ridicule, where my worth is not measured solely by my wealth." So, as we peel back the layers of Victorian society, it's clear that the era's gender dynamics were a complex web of expectation and reality. While the outer trappings of romance and domesticity might have seemed idyllic, the truth beneath was often far more complicated. The Victorians were masters at presenting a polished exterior, but beneath that surface lay a world of contradictions and unmet desires. As we continue to unravel the intricacies of this fascinating period, remember that the Victorian era was one of both constraint and innovation, a time when people were both defined by their roles and desperate to transcend them. Stay tuned as we explore more of this paradoxical world, where the dance between appearance and reality never quite ends. Now, as we unravel the intricacies of this paradoxical world, let's dive headfirst into the elaborate dance of Victorian etiquette, where maintaining social order required more choreography than a Broadway musical. The Victorians had a penchant for rules that would give even the most dedicated bureaucrat a run for their money. Etiquette wasn't just about knowing which fork to use, it was a full-on lifestyle choice, a way to announce to the world that you weren't just any commoner, you were a commoner with class. At the helm of all this social rigmarole was none other than Queen Victoria herself. She wasn't just the monarch, she was the ultimate influencer of her day. Forget Instagram or TikTok. Victoria's every move set trends that rippled through society like a perfectly aimed pebble skimming a pond. Take her mourning practices, for instance. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria plunged into a deep, unending mourning. And by unending, I mean she wore black for the rest of her life. The nation, not wanting to appear less devoted, followed suit, and mourning became an industry, with black fabric sales skyrocketing. The mourning period for a spouse was set at 2 years, but if you really wanted to show your devotion, you could stretch it out indefinitely. Talk about dedication. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Victorian etiquette began long before one needed to don their mourning attire. It was a daily ritual, a social performance where every gesture was scrutinized. Imagine being at a social gathering, teacup in hand, when suddenly you remember the correct angle for a bow. Yes, there was indeed a scientifically determined angle that was deemed socially acceptable. A bow too shallow suggested arrogance. Too deep implied subservience. According to Lord Chesterfield's letters, a bow should be easy and natural, as if anything about Victorian etiquette could be described thusly. The rules didn't stop there. Oh no, they seeped into every corner of life. Victorians believed that the social order, much like a fine souffle, would collapse without the right ingredients. So they created a complex web of do's and don'ts that kept everyone in their place. For instance, the way you addressed someone was a social minefield. Titles were paramount. Call someone by their first name without permission, and you might as well have shown up wearing last season's frock. Even the act of sitting was fraught with peril. Ladies were instructed never to cross their legs. It was considered both unladylike and suggestive. Instead, they were to sit with ankles demurely crossed and skirts arranged just so. The upper echelons of society took these rules to absurd lengths, using them to delineate class distinctions as clear as day. The unwritten code of conduct was a velvet rope separating the refined from the rabble. And if you were on the wrong side of that rope, well, tough luck. Your chances of social mobility were about as high as a snowball's in a Victorian factory furnace. But here's the kicker. While the upper crust was busy perfecting their social dances, the working class was left to marvel at the spectacle. For them, the idea of mastering such a complex etiquette was as remote as a trip to the moon. They were more concerned with putting bread on the table than with the intricacies of a proper bow. Yet the allure of upward mobility was strong. Even those with no hope of breaking into high society couldn't resist the siren call of refined manners, which is why manuals on etiquette sold like hotcakes among the middle class. Ah, the etiquette manual, a curious creation of the Victorian age. These were not just books, they were lifelines, providing the keys to the kingdom for anyone daring enough to dream of a better life. The Habits of Good Society, a popular tome of the time, promised to make its readers fit for any society. It offered pearls of wisdom on everything from how to send a proper invitation to the correct way to hold a fan. A single misstep could lead to social ruin, so learning the rules was as essential as knowing your ABCs. Let's also debunk the myth that Victorians were naturally adept at following these rules. In reality, they were as baffled by them as we are today. Diaries and letters from the era often mention the anxiety induced by the fear of making a social blunder. One young woman wrote of her dread at attending her first ball, terrified she might drop her dance card or, even worse, call a viscount by the wrong title. It's a wonder these people didn't develop a collective case of high blood pressure given the stress they endured. And let's circle back to Queen Victoria, the woman who made mourning chic. Her influence was pervasive, and her personal style choices were mimicked with a fervour that would make modern fashionistas blush. Victoria's taste in art, architecture, and even pets shaped the preferences of her subjects. The Queen's love for the Scottish Highlands led to a tartan craze, with the pattern adorning everything from clothing to home decor. Her penchant for family values was celebrated in the countless portraits of her with her children. Never mind the fact that behind closed doors, her relationships with her kids were often strained. It's worth noting that many of these social rules were more about perception than practicality. They created a facade of order and decorum, masking the chaos of a society in flux. The Industrial Revolution was turning the world on its head, and as people migrated to cities, the traditional social structures were crumbling. Etiquette offered a comforting illusion of stability, a way to cling to the familiar as the future loomed uncertainly on the horizon. So, as you sip your imaginary Victorian tea and practice your bow at the perfect 30-degree angle, remember that etiquette was more than just a set of rules. It was a tool for maintaining order, a way to reinforce class distinctions, and a testament to the lengths people would go to keep up appearances in a rapidly changing world. The Victorians might have seemed prim and proper, but beneath that polished surface lay a society grappling with the same complexities and contradictions that we face today. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the layers of this fascinating era, where the dance of etiquette was just one of many steps in the intricate waltz of Victorian life. So, as we continue our journey through Victorian society, let's address the elephant in the parlour, the myth of the good old days. Nostalgia, a potent concoction that makes the past seem like a rose-tinted utopia. But let's take a peek behind the velvet curtains of Victorian life, shall we? This era, often romanticised as a time of elegance and grandeur, was also riddled with contradictions and inequality. First, let's talk about the social rules that kept everything in check, or at least appeared to. These weren't just quaint guidelines for good behaviour, they were the iron bars of a gilded cage. The etiquette manuals, those opulent paperbacks, painted a picture of a society where everyone knew their place and behaved accordingly. But beneath that polished veneer lay a plethora of societal issues that no amount of curtsying could conceal. Poverty, child labour, and horrendous working conditions were rampant. In 1840, about 20% of Britain's population was living in abject poverty, a stark contrast to the glittering ballrooms of the well-to-do. Take child labour, for instance. While a young lady of means was learning the art of the perfect tea pour, children in the working class were toiling in factories, mines, and on the streets. By 1850, nearly a third of the workforce in Britain's cotton mills were children under 13. These kids didn't have the luxury of worrying about social faux pas, they were more concerned with surviving another day. In this light, the Victorian obsession with decorum and appearance seems, well, a bit like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And let's not forget the societal undercurrents that kept the class system afloat. The middle and upper classes were often too busy maintaining appearances to see, or perhaps they chose to ignore, the grinding poverty beneath them. The opulence of a dinner party might have been impressive, but it was also a smokescreen, a way to distract from the fact that for many, life was a relentless struggle. The social rules that dictated who could speak to whom and in what manner reinforced a hierarchy that was as rigid as it was unjust. Now, you might wonder why, despite all this, the Victorian era still enchants us. Why do we find these social rules so fascinating today? Part of it is the allure of a time when life seemed simpler, neatly organised into do's and don'ts. There's a certain charm in the idea of a world where everyone knew their role, where a well-executed bow could open doors. It's a comforting fantasy, especially in today's chaotic world where rules seem more like suggestions. But here's the kicker. Many of these Victorian ideals have wormed their way into modern life. The concept of keeping up appearances is alive and well, albeit in different guises. We may not be worrying about the angle of our bow, but we're certainly curating our social media feeds with the same meticulous care. It's the modern equivalent of a Victorian calling card, a carefully orchestrated presentation of self. The desire to project an image of success and happiness, even when reality doesn't quite match up, is a legacy the Victorians would surely recognise. And let's talk about the notion of proper conduct. While we're not bound by the same strict etiquette manuals, the pressure to conform to societal norms persists. Whether it's the expectation to reply to emails within a certain time frame or the unwritten rules of office culture, we still navigate a world filled with social landmines. The medium may have changed, but the message remains the same. Appearances matter. So, as we take a final bow in our exploration of Victorian social rules, let's acknowledge both the allure and the reality. The past wasn't as idyllic as nostalgia might have us believe. It was a time of stark contrasts, where the glitter of high society often masked the grim realities faced by many. Yet even in a world governed by rigid etiquette, there were those who challenged the status quo, who pushed against the boundaries of their prescribed roles. Their stories remind us that while social rules can confine, they can also inspire change. In the end, the Victorian era offers us a mirror reflecting both the best and worst of human nature. It shows us a world striving for order amid chaos, a society clinging to appearances as a way to navigate uncertainty. And as we sip our imaginary tea, perhaps we can take heart in knowing how far we've come. We've traded corsets and calling cards for smartphones and social media, but the dance between appearance and reality continues. The Victorian legacy lingers, a testament to the enduring human quest for identity and belonging. As we close the chapter on this fascinating era, let's carry forward its lessons, mindful of both its grandeur and its flaws. In the grand tapestry of ancient history, the Phoenicians were the ones who stitched in a dazzling splash of deep-sea purple. Nestled along the eastern Mediterranean, think modern-day Lebanon. The Phoenicians weren't just chilling by the seaside. No, they were busy crafting an empire of cloth and colour that would make even the most flamboyant of modern fashionistas blush. Their secret weapon? A dye so exclusive it was like the Hermès Birkin bag of its day, Tyrian purple. Now, before you dismiss Tyrian purple as just another colour, know this. It wasn't concocted in a lab or squeezed from innocent berries. It came from snail goo. Yes, you heard that right. The Phoenicians harvested this luxurious hue from the murex snail, a creature that, let's be honest, doesn't exactly scream fashion icon. Extracting a single gram of dye required tens of thousands of these little guys, which was as labour-intensive as it was slimy. But the payoff? Royalty across the Mediterranean was eager to drape themselves in fabrics dyed with the stuff, each robe a vivid reminder of the wearer's wealth and status. The Phoenicians didn't just stumble upon this lucrative mollusk colour by accident. Their cities, like Tyre and Sidon, were perfectly positioned to exploit the Mediterranean's marine life and trade routes. These people were the OG maritime entrepreneurs, navigating the choppy waters of commerce with the finesse of a seasoned sailor. They weren't just trading textiles, they were weaving a network of connections from Cyprus to Carthage, and even as far as Spain. For the Phoenicians, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Let's put some numbers to this colourful narrative. A single royal garment dyed in Tyrian purple could cost as much as a house. It's no wonder that the colour became synonymous with prestige and power. Roman emperors, those ancient masters of PR, were some of the biggest fans. They decreed that only the elite could don this shade, making it illegal for commoners to wear. Talk about controlling the narrative through fashion. Of course, the snails themselves were less about haute couture and more about survival, but hey, nobody asked them. But let's step back from the snail slime for a moment. The Phoenicians' textile acumen wasn't limited to just dye. They were also masters of spinning and weaving, producing fabrics that were not only vibrant but also durable. In an era where clothing wasn't just a fashion statement but a practical necessity, this was a big deal. Their trade networks ensured that their textiles were highly sought after, making them the ancient world's equivalent of Gucci or Chanel. What made all of this possible, besides their strategic geographical location, was the Phoenicians' knack for innovation and adaptation. They borrowed techniques and styles from their neighbours, Egyptians, Assyrians, you name it, and improved upon them, blending them into something uniquely Phoenician. They were cultural magpies, picking the shiniest bits from others and weaving them into their own rich tapestry. Now, it's tempting to romanticize the Phoenicians as a peaceful, commercial people who spread culture and commerce across the Mediterranean like some ancient, benevolent Amazon. But let's not get carried away with the fairy tales. The truth is, their dominance was built on hard-nosed trade agreements, shrewd diplomacy, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of maritime muscle flexing. You don't become the epicenter of ancient trade by playing nice all the time. All this from a civilization that historians still struggle to fully decipher. Much of what we know comes from their trading partners and rivals, like the Greeks and Romans, who were not exactly unbiased observers. The Phoenicians themselves left us little in the way of written records. They were too busy perfecting the art of the deal and, presumably, scrubbing snail goo off their hands. In a nutshell, the Phoenicians turned what could have been a simple seaside existence into a thriving empire of trade and textiles. They took the humble snail and transformed it into a symbol of power and prestige. And while the Murex snails might not have appreciated their role in this ancient fashion revolution, the impact of Tyrian purple was undeniable. It was a colour that could launch 1,000 ships, or at least 1,000 ships' worth of trade goods. So, next time you see a splash of purple, think of the Phoenicians and their genius for turning the mundane into the magnificent. Just be grateful you didn't have to harvest snails to get it. So, while you're enjoying your purple-hued daydreams of the past, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of how this legendary colour and the textiles it adorned came to be. Picture this: a bustling Phoenician coastal city where the air is thick with the smell of the sea and probably a hint of snail, if we're being honest. The production of Tyrian purple was no simple task. It was a labour-intensive, smelly affair that started with the Murex snails. The process kicked off with the collection of these not-so-glamorous critters. Picture armies of workers, likely slaves or indentured servants, combing the rocky shores for Murex snails. We're talking about tens of thousands of these little guys needed just for a single gram of dye. If you ever felt bad about your snail pace on a Monday morning, just remember, these snails were quite literally the pace of an entire industry. Once gathered, the snails were left to decompose. Yes, you heard right, decompose. This was no poppy field of pleasant aromas. The stench was enough to make even the hardiest of sailors think twice about their career choices. Once the snails had sufficiently ripened, their shells were cracked to extract the precious mucus. This was the magic goo that, after some chemistry wizardry involving sunlight and oxidation, transformed into the coveted Tyrian purple. The whole process was akin to an ancient chemistry experiment with a lot more slime and considerably less safety gear. The workers, enduring this pungent ordeal, were the unsung heroes of this lucrative trade, their toil lost in the annals of history, overshadowed by the glamorous image of the finished product. Now, let's talk weaving. The Phoenicians were more than just dye makers, they were master weavers. Their textiles were not only brilliantly coloured but also intricately patterned. Weaving was a skilled craft, requiring deft fingers and a keen eye for detail. Imagine rows of looms clattering away, threads dancing back and forth under the skilled hands of artisans. This wasn't a hobby, it was a full-blown industry. Textiles were produced using vertical looms, a method that allowed for complex designs and durability, a necessity when your target market includes kings and emperors with a penchant for elaborate robes. Here's where the romanticized image of the artisan gets a reality check. While we might envision these weavers as inspired creatives, the truth was far grittier. Many of the workers, including children, were subjected to long hours and harsh conditions. The romantic notion of the lone artisan, lovingly crafting each piece by hand, fades away when you consider the scale of production required to meet demand. It was less about artistic expression and more about meeting quotas and maintaining quality. Economically, Phoenician textiles were a game changer. These weren't just clothes, they were currency. The fabrics moved along trade routes that were the ancient equivalent of today's global supply chains. From the shores of the Levant, they travelled to Egypt, across the Aegean to Greece, and farther afield to the Iberian Peninsula and beyond. These trade routes were the arteries of ancient commerce, pumping wealth and influence across the Mediterranean. Let's talk numbers, because who doesn't love a good data point? A piece of cloth dyed in Tyrian purple could cost up to 20 times more than the average garment. To put that into perspective, it was like rocking a custom-made designer suit in a world of off-the-rack outfits. The high price tag wasn't just about the dye's exclusivity. It reflected the entire laborious process from snail to sale. And for the elite, price was no object when it came to displaying wealth and power. Meanwhile, the Phoenician economy thrived on this trade. The wealth generated from textiles and other goods, like glass and cedar wood, propelled their cities to prominence. Tyre and Sidon were more than just ports. They were booming economic centres, bustling with merchants, traders and craftsmen. The Phoenicians were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, their innovations driving trade and influencing cultures far beyond their own shores. The romance of the Phoenician textile industry lies in its legacy. The colours, the patterns, the story of a civilization that wrapped itself in its own ingenuity. Yet, the reality was far more complex and less glamorous. It was a world built on hard labour, economic strategy, and a little bit of snail slime. And while the Phoenician legacy is often overshadowed by their more famous neighbours, their impact on trade and culture was profound. In the end, the Phoenicians remind us that history is woven from both the vibrant threads of legend and the stark fibres of reality. Their story isn't just about the dazzling colour of Tyrian purple, but about the people, the processes, and the economics that made it possible. So next time you see a royal hue or a piece of intricate fabric, take a moment to appreciate the ancient hands and minds that crafted the very idea of luxury. The Phoenicians, with their vibrant textiles, weren't just stitching clothes. They were stitching together a tapestry of power dynamics and alliances across the ancient world. Their knack for turning fabric into fortune gave them a seat at the table with the big dogs of antiquity, like the Egyptians and Greeks. To the untrained eye, it might seem like the Phoenicians were merely the fashionistas of their time. But oh no, they were also the crafty diplomats, weaving alliances and rivalries as deftly as they did their textiles. Let's start with the Egyptians. Now, these guys were no strangers to luxury. I mean, they built pyramids as eternal resting places, so their appetite for opulence was as vast as the Sahara. The Phoenicians, ever the savvy business people, knew that the Egyptians' love for luxury could be their golden ticket, or perhaps their purple ticket. By supplying Egypt with their renowned textiles, the Phoenicians gained not just wealth, but influence, becoming key players in the Mediterranean Game of Thrones. The Egyptians, in return, opened their gates and their purses, allowing Phoenician traders into their bustling markets. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. You see, the Egyptians had a bit of a superiority complex. They were the cultural and political heavyweights of the time. Yet even they couldn't resist the allure of Tyrian purple, a colour so rare and revered that it was practically the ancient world's version of a black Amex card. This dynamic, where the Phoenicians could hold even the mighty Egyptians enthralled to their textiles, speaks volumes about their economic clout and diplomatic finesse. The Greeks, on the other hand, were a different kettle of fish, or amphora of olive oil, if you will. They were less about centralized power and more about city-states, each with its own quirks and ambitions. The Phoenicians, ever the adaptable merchants, were quick to exploit these fragmented political landscapes. They established colonies throughout the Mediterranean, with Carthage eventually emerging as the jewel in their colonial crown. This put them in direct contact and often competition with the Greeks. Yet it was a competition that both parties found profitable. Phoenician textiles were in high demand in places like Athens and Corinth, where the elite couldn't resist showing off their wealth in vibrant hues. But it wasn't just about the trade of goods, it was about the exchange of ideas. The Greeks, with their penchant for philosophy and innovation, were influenced by Phoenician craftsmanship and vice versa. This cultural cross-pollination was as valuable as the trade goods themselves, a testament to the Phoenicians' role as cultural conduits as well as merchants. Now, let's bust a myth wide open, the notion that the Phoenicians were just traders. It's like saying Steve Jobs was just a guy who liked computers. The Phoenicians were political strategists, using their trade networks to forge alliances and exert influence. Consider their strategic marriages. These were no mere romantic unions. Marriages were contracts, binding families and forging alliances as strong as any ironclad treaty. By marrying into influential families, the Phoenicians extended their influence beyond the marketplace and into the very halls of power. Take the marriage alliances with the Israelites, for example. King Ahab of Israel married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess. This wasn't just a love match, it was a power play. Through such alliances, the Phoenicians secured their trade routes and maintained favourable terms with their neighbours. These marital manoeuvres were as carefully crafted as their textiles, each thread precisely placed to ensure the stability and prosperity of their trade networks. But let's not get too misty-eyed about these political unions. They were as much about survival as they were about strategy. The Phoenicians knew that to thrive in a world dominated by larger powers, they needed more than just pretty fabrics. They needed allies. Their marriages were strategic gambits in a high-stakes game where the prize was not just wealth, but survival. It's tempting to view the Phoenicians through the rose-tinted lenses of Romanticism, picturing them as merchants of culture and commerce, spreading enlightenment across the Mediterranean. And while there's a nugget of truth in that, the reality was far more complex. They were shrewd operators, navigating a world of political intrigue and economic competition. Their textiles were not just commodities, but tools of diplomacy, their vibrant colours masking the gritty realities of ancient power politics. In the end, the Phoenicians remind us that history isn't just about grand narratives or lofty ideals. It's also about the everyday grind, the strategic choices, and yes, the occasional snail slime. Their legacy is a testament to the power of innovation and diplomacy, showing us that even in a world dominated by empires, there's room for the little guy, or in this case, the little snail, to make a big impact. So, the next time you slip into something luxurious, remember the Phoenicians. They were more than just traders. They were the architects of an ancient world where textiles weren't just for wearing, but for wielding influence and weaving history. And while the story isn't finished yet, one thing's for sure. Their legacy is as colourful and enduring as the Tyrian purple that helped build it. Stay tuned, because there's more to unravel in the saga of these ancient textile titans. As the vibrant hues of Tyrian purple slowly began to fade from the Mediterranean stage, the Phoenicians found themselves caught in a complex web of changing tides and rising contenders. Their textile empire, once unrivaled, was undergoing a transformation that was less of a dramatic collapse and more of a gradual sunset. One dyed in the colours of strategic missteps and emerging competitors. Let's set the stage. It's the 8th century BCE. The world is buzzing with activity, and not the kind that involves sipping wine on a Mediterranean beach. We're talking expansion, exploration, and a bit of good old-fashioned conquest. The Phoenicians had long been the textile titans, but new players were eyeing their throne. Enter the Greeks, those clever city-state dwellers who were as interested in philosophy as they were in commerce. They began to challenge the Phoenicians on their own turf, establishing colonies and trade networks that vied for dominance. The Greeks weren't just copying the Phoenician playbook, they were rewriting it. By setting up shop in locations like Sicily and southern Italy, they positioned themselves as serious contenders in the Mediterranean marketplace. This wasn't just a game of Monopoly with wooden ships and murex snails. It was a strategic chess match, with each colony a pawn in a larger game of influence and economic control. Meanwhile, the Assyrians up north were flexing their military muscles. From the 9th century BCE onwards, they expanded their empire with all the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store. Their campaigns into the Levantine coast brought them to the doorstep of Phoenician cities, who suddenly found themselves with a new set of rules to play by. It turns out, when a military powerhouse like Assyria shows up at your door, you either adapt or get swept away. The Phoenicians opted for diplomacy, paying tribute to avoid destruction, but these payments were a double-edged sword, cutting into their economic lifeblood. And let's not forget the internal dynamics at play. The Phoenician cities, always fiercely independent, were like siblings in a family feud, cooperating when necessary, but ultimately each looking out for their own interests. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos and others were often more concerned with local rivalries than with presenting a united front against external threats. This disunity chipped away at their ability to respond effectively to the challenges that loomed larger with each passing decade. Amidst this backdrop, the tides of trade were shifting. The ever-savvy Greeks began to innovate, developing new dyes and techniques that rivaled the Phoenicians' own. In particular, the Greeks experimented with indigo and kermes dyes, offering alternatives to the once exclusive Tyrian purple. With these new options came a democratization of color. Suddenly, you didn't need a king's ransom to dress like one. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about the erosion of the Phoenicians' monopoly on luxury. The economic landscape was also changing. By the 6th century BCE, Babylonian and Persian empires rose to prominence, reshaping trade routes and political alliances. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great and later Darius I, established an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, incorporating Phoenician cities into their administrative framework. While this provided some stability, it also meant that Phoenician independence was now more myth than reality. Their cities became cogs in a much larger imperial machine, their once proud maritime autonomy reduced to a whisper of its former self. But let's not paint this picture entirely in sombre tones. The decline of Phoenician dominance wasn't a Shakespearean tragedy so much as a gradual reallocation of power. Their legacy lived on in the very fabric of Mediterranean commerce. The techniques they pioneered were adopted and adapted by cultures across the region. Their trade routes became highways for the exchange of ideas as much as goods, ensuring that the Phoenician influence endured even as their political clout waned. And while some might mourn the loss of their textile empire, it's worth noting that the Phoenicians were nothing if not resilient. They didn't vanish into the annals of history, they evolved, assimilating into the cultures around them. The Carthaginians, their descendants in North Africa, would rise to prominence in their own right, carrying the torch of Phoenician ingenuity into new arenas of trade and conflict. So, as we unravel the tapestry of Phoenician history, it's clear that their story is one of adaptation as much as it is of decline. Their vibrant threads may have dimmed, but they left an indelible mark on the ancient world, one that reminds us that even the mightiest empires are built on the backs of snails and the cunning of those who dare to dream in colour. Stay tuned, because the story of these ancient textile titans is far from over. As we stitch together the final threads of our tale, let's step back and admire the tapestry of Phoenician influence that unfurled across the ancient world. Sure, their empire didn't end with a dramatic curtain drop, but rather a gradual dimming of the spotlight. Yet, their legacy shimmered on, weaving through the fabric of history with a tenacity that would make even the most resilient murex snail blush. First, let's talk technique. Because if the Phoenicians were anything, they were masters of it. Their innovations in textile production didn't just vanish into the sand-dusted winds of time. Nope, they passed on the baton, inspiring subsequent civilizations with their savvy methods. Take the Greeks, for instance. They might have been latecomers to the luxury dye party, but they were quick learners. Mimicking Phoenician craftsmanship, they began to dabble in their own dye experiments, eventually developing alternatives like indigo. It was like Phoenicians had handed them the keys to a colourful kingdom, and the Greeks were eager apprentices, ready to unlock the secrets of the spectrum. Then there were the Romans, those empire-building aficionados who took a leaf or perhaps a bolt of cloth out of the Phoenician playbook. Roman textile production borrowed heavily from Phoenician expertise, particularly in the art of dyeing and weaving. The Romans were no strangers to the allure of Tyrian purple, with their emperors draping themselves in the hue as if it were a badge of divine right. The Phoenicians may have been the original influences, but the Romans were the ones who turned it into a full-blown empire-wide trend, complete with edicts and exclusivity. Talk about a power move. Economically, the Phoenicians set the stage for what we now recognize as global trade practices. They were the prototype for the savvy entrepreneur, navigating not just literal seas, but the turbulent waters of international commerce. Their trade routes and networks became the lifeblood of the Mediterranean, a sprawling web that connected cultures and economies. Fast forward a few centuries, and we see echoes of their model in the Silk Road, and later the maritime routes of the Age of Exploration. The Phoenicians were the OG networkers, their influence rippling through the ages like waves on the high seas. But here's where we peel back the romantic veneer and take a closer look at those gritty truths. The Phoenician legacy, while undeniably impactful, wasn't all sun-drenched sails and vibrant markets. It was also a tale of hard labour, economic strategizing, and, let's face it, a fair bit of geopolitical arm wrestling. Their success wasn't solely built on the beauty of their textiles, but on the backs of countless workers who endured the drudgery of production. The romance of the Phoenician story is tinged with the reality of sweat, toil, and a little bit of snail slime. A reminder that the shine of history often comes with a patina of grit. And what about those myths, those tantalizing tales that cast the Phoenicians as the benevolent merchants of the Mediterranean? Well, there's a kernel of truth in them, but it's wrapped in layers of complexity. The Phoenicians were indeed cultural conduits, spreading ideas and innovations as deftly as they spread their textiles. Yet, they were also shrewd operators, their sails filled with the winds of ambition and diplomacy. Romanticizing them as peaceful traders belies the strategic machinations that underpinned their success. They navigated a world rife with power plays and intrigue, leveraging their economic clout to secure their place in the annals of history. So, as we wrap up our journey through the Phoenician saga, what do we take away? It's a story that's as much about vibrant hues as it is about the darker shades of human endeavour. The Phoenicians remind us that history isn't painted in broad strokes of good or bad, but in the intricate patterns of human ambition and ingenuity. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring power of innovation, a reminder that even the humblest beginnings, like the goo of a murex snail, can leave a lasting mark on the world. As you settle in with this new knowledge, consider how history, like the finest textile, is woven from threads both bright and shadowed. The Phoenicians may have faded into the background, but their influence lingers, a testament to the complexity and resilience of human enterprise. And with that, our tale concludes, leaving you with the vibrant legacy of a people who dared to dream in colour long before it was fashionable. In the rain-drenched town of Greenock, Scotland, a place where even sheep probably wore raincoats, there was a boy who was infinitely more interested in the mysteries of steam than in the soggy landscape around him. Meet young James Watt, born in 1786, who would one day become the MVP of the Industrial Revolution. But before he was the steam engine savant, he was just a curious kid tinkering in his father's workshop, oblivious to the fact that he'd soon be making waves in history. And steam, lots of steam. Let's talk about his father, James Watt Sr. Now, Watt Sr. was no ordinary dad with a penchant for DIY. He was a skilled craftsman, a shipwright, and a builder with a workshop that was basically the 18th century equivalent of a modern-day tech start-up garage. Little James spent more time there than on his math homework, which, to be fair, was probably just as perplexing as the enigmas of steam. One particular day in this bustling workshop, young James had a revelation that would spark a lifelong obsession. It wasn't a visit from a wise old sage or a dramatic lightning bolt moment. Nope, it was a broken kettle. That's right, folks, the kind of kettle that today would just be chucked out or replaced with a new model on Amazon. But to young Watt, it was a steam-powered epiphany. As he watched the steam lift the kettle lid like a ghost trying to escape, it dawned on him that there was a powerhouse in those vapours, just waiting to be harnessed. Now, while his friends were out pretending to be knights or whatever kids did for fun before video games, Watt was busy pondering why steam could move things. It was an unusual hobby for an 18th century lad, but then again, so was changing the world. And Watt was on the cusp of doing just that. The 18th century in Britain was an era of massive change, where farmers were transforming into factory workers, and coal seemed more valuable than gold. It was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a time when the term working from home meant you were either a farmer or unemployed. Steam power was the new kid on the block, and it was about to take over. But before steam engines were running the show, people relied on horsepower, literal horses, not the metaphorical kind. As James tinkered away, the economic backdrop of Britain was shifting faster than you could say industrialization. The population was booming, cities were growing, and folks were suddenly obsessed with efficiency, which, in a world without smartphones, was quite the feat. The demand for coal was skyrocketing, since it powered everything that was anything, from homes to the burgeoning factories that were popping up like daisies in the spring. But let's not romanticize it too much. The Industrial Revolution might sound like a thrilling time for inventors and entrepreneurs, but for the average Joe, it meant long hours, low pay, and working conditions that would make a modern-day health and safety officer faint. Children worked in factories instead of playing hopscotch or whatever else kids did before the internet. It was gritty, grimy, and not for the faint-hearted. Amidst this whirlwind of change, our young Watt was soaking up knowledge like a sponge. He had a voracious appetite for learning and a knack for mathematics, which, back then, was probably about as cool as knowing how to code is today. He wasn't just a thinker, he was a doer, always eager to turn theory into practice. Watt's journey wasn't without its hurdles, though. Scotland in the 18th century wasn't exactly the land of opportunity for aspiring inventors. Education was a luxury, not a right, and young James had to make do with what he could get. His mother taught him reading and arithmetic, and his father helped him develop his knack for mechanics. But formal schooling? That was another story. Watt was mostly self-taught, proving that sometimes the best classroom is the world around you, especially if it includes a broken kettle and a head full of curiosity. At the time, steam engines weren't exactly a new concept. The Newcomen engine, invented in 1712, was already making waves, well, more like ripples, given its inefficiency. It was used primarily to pump water out of mines, but it guzzled coal like a hungry beast and was about as efficient as a chocolate teapot. Watt, however, saw potential. He recognized that, with a bit of ingenuity, maybe a lot, steam engines could revolutionize industry. As Watt grew older, the allure of London, with its bustling streets and opportunities, proved irresistible. At 18, he travelled to the city to learn instrument making, an essential skill for anyone looking to dabble in engineering at the time. But the journey wasn't all smooth sailing. London was expensive, and Watt faced financial struggles. Yet, the experience was invaluable. He returned to Scotland armed with knowledge and a determination to make the most of it. Before long, Watt's talents caught the attention of the University of Glasgow. In 1757, he was appointed as an instrument maker for the university, a role that would shape his future in ways he couldn't have imagined. Here, he rubbed shoulders with some of the most brilliant minds of the time, gaining insights and inspiration that would fuel his innovations. Watt's early years were a blend of curiosity, opportunity, and a bit of luck. He was a boy who saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. And while the Industrial Revolution was still in its infancy, Watt was already laying the groundwork for a future where steam would become the heartbeat of progress. Little did he know, his steam-powered dreams would soon lift him from the reigns of Greenock to the pantheon of history's great inventors. Now, our hero, James Watt, wasn't just a dreamer with a head full of steam and visions of industrial glory. He had to put his money where his mouth, or rather, his pocket was. And in 1755, when he set sail for London, his pockets were about as deep as a puddle in the Sahara. Picture young Watt, just 19, arriving in the Big Smoke with a budget tighter than a Victorian corset, ready to learn the craft of mathematical instrument making. London, at the time, was a sprawling metropolis, a place where opportunity and poverty rubbed shoulders like commuters on a crowded tube. Watt, eager to learn, found himself apprenticed to a mathematical instrument maker. His job was to craft precision tools that were as crucial to engineers as a smartphone is to a modern-day teenager. But here's the kicker. Despite the importance of his work, Watt was paid peanuts. Well, not literally peanuts, but close enough. Living on a shoestring budget meant Watt's diet was mostly a culinary carousel of bread and cheese. He probably knew more about the subtle nuances of cheddar than he did about steam engines at that point. His accommodations were as humble as his meals, but Watt wasn't deterred. He was like a sponge, soaking up knowledge and skills, even if he had to squeeze every penny until it begged for mercy. Now, let's pause for a moment to debunk the myth of the overnight success. The romantic notion that Watt woke up one day with a fully formed steam engine in his head is about as accurate as a weather forecast in a Scottish winter. In reality, Watt's path was riddled with more obstacles than a steeplechase. His time in London was less about eureka moments and more about grinding it out day by day, mastering his craft. After a year that felt like a decade, Watt returned to Glasgow in 1756, armed with skills and a resolve forged in the fires of financial hardship. Glasgow was no London, but it was a bustling hub of intellect and industry. Here, Watt's fortunes took a turn for the better when he secured a position at the University of Glasgow. His role? Crafting instruments for the university, a gig that paid better than his London stint and came with the bonus of rubbing elbows with the sharpest minds around. It's worth noting that while Watt was now back in Scotland, his mind was still in London, buzzing with ideas and possibilities. His experience in the city had left him with more than just an appreciation for frugality, it had given him a vision. He recognized the inefficiencies in existing steam engines, like the Newcomen engine which, despite its innovative edge, was about as efficient as trying to fill a leaky bucket. But let's not pretend Watt was instantly hailed as the saviour of steam. The truth was, the world of invention was more cutthroat than a pirate mutiny. Watt had to fight tooth and nail to make his mark, battling not just technical challenges, but the inertia of a world resistant to change. He didn't have the luxury of a supportive ecosystem for startups like today. Instead, he had to rely on his wits, his allies at the university, and a fair bit of Scottish stubbornness. Now, while Watt's early career wasn't exactly a fairy tale, it was a crucial chapter in the saga of innovation. His struggles weren't just personal, they were emblematic of the broader challenges faced by inventors in an era where progress was a hard-won prize. In many ways, Watt's experience was a microcosm of the Industrial Revolution itself, a blend of grit, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. And so, as Watt tinkered away in Glasgow, he laid the groundwork for what would become a seismic shift in industry. His time in London might have been short and sharp, but it left an indelible mark on his journey. He returned to Scotland not with a pocket full of riches, but with something far more valuable, the determination and insight to change the world, one steam engine at a time. Meanwhile, the fabric of society was changing around him as industries and economies began to realize the potential of harnessing steam power. In the next part of our tale, we'll see how Watt's ideas began to take shape, transforming from mere sketches on paper to the engines that would fuel the fires of revolution. But for now, let's leave our inventor in his Glasgow workshop, contemplating the possibilities of steam with a head full of dreams and a heart full of determination. After all, history is a story, and Watt's was just beginning. As Watt sat amidst the clatter of his Glasgow workshop, scheming over steam-powered dreams, the universe had a twist in store that even he couldn't have predicted. Enter Matthew Bolton, an entrepreneur with a knack for spotting potential like a hawk eyeing its next meal. Bolton was the kind of guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo, but more importantly, he had the means and the mindset to turn Watt's steam engine fantasies into reality. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Getting to this partnership was a bumpy ride, fraught with more twists and turns than a soap opera. Financially, Watt was about as buoyant as a lead balloon. His eureka moment with the separate condenser, an ingenious solution to the Newcomen engine's inefficiency, was a work of art in theory, but in practice it was as useful as a chocolate teapot without the right backing. Watt's separate condenser was a stroke of brilliance, a light bulb moment in an era before light bulbs even existed. What he figured out was simple, yet revolutionary. Instead of cooling the entire cylinder in steam engines, which wasted an obscene amount of energy, he would cool the steam in a separate chamber. Boom! Just like that, the engine became more efficient, cutting coal consumption dramatically. Watt's design promised to sip coal like a fine wine rather than chug it like cheap beer. But promises weren't enough. He needed cold, hard cash to make it a reality. Enter Bolton, stage right. This Birmingham businessman was as sharp as a tack and twice as ambitious. He ran the Soho manufactory, a veritable hive of innovation and industry where ideas were as common as tea bags. Bolton had been searching for a way to power his factory more efficiently, and when he heard about Watt's tinkering, he saw not just an opportunity, but a revolution in the making. Their meeting was less a chance encounter and more of a preordained collision of necessity and opportunity. Watt needed money, Bolton needed a better engine. It was a match made not in heaven, but in the gritty, smoke-filled air of industrial Britain. In 1775, the dynamic duo officially partnered up, forming Bolton and Watt. While Watt brought the brains and the blueprints, Bolton offered the business acumen and financial muscle. Together, they were like Batman and Robin if Gotham was a factory and the Joker was inefficiency. But let's not get all misty-eyed about this partnership. The road to industrial success was paved with paperwork, lawsuits, and a fair share of headaches. First, they had to secure a patent for Watt's design, which was no small feat. Patents in the 18th century were as coveted as gold, and the process was as bureaucratic as a modern-day DMV visit. In fact, Bolton had to use his considerable charm and connections to navigate the legal labyrinth, eventually securing an extension on Watt's patent in 1775, a move that was as crucial to their success as the engine itself. Financial hurdles loomed larger than life. The initial costs of development and production were astronomical, and Watt's knack for spending more time in the workshop than on a budget plan didn't help. They faced more financial strain than a college student in a bookstore. Bolton's business savvy kept the ship afloat, but it was a constant battle against insolvency. The real magic happened when they finally got their steam engines into the field. Bolton and Watt engines were like the Teslas of their day, sleeker, more efficient, and the stuff of industrialists' dreams. They first applied their engines to pump water out of mines, a task that had been the bane of miners since time immemorial. The result? A massive success. The new engines were like putting a turbocharger in a beat-up old sedan. boosting efficiency and slashing costs. Amusingly, the industrial world was still skeptical. Some folks thought steam power was just a fad, like 18th century bell-bottoms. But as more engines were installed, skepticism turned to awe. Boulton and Watt became the talk of the town, and their engines were in high demand. They had cracked the code, turning industrial might from a pipe dream into a steamy reality. Their partnership wasn't all work and no play, though. Boulton and Watt were known for their colourful characters and escapades. There was the time they had to fend off competitors trying to steal their designs. A real-life drama that could put any modern corporate espionage thriller to shame. And then there were the inevitable breakdowns and repairs, which Watt handled with the calm precision of a surgeon. The man was a tinkerer at heart, after all, and every malfunction was just another puzzle to solve. During this era, Britain was transforming faster than a caterpillar on a caffeine binge. The Industrial Revolution was picking up steam, pun entirely intended, and industries were clamouring for Watt's engines. They powered everything from textile mills to breweries, literally fueling the economy and, quite possibly, the average Brit's penchant for ale. The economic impact of Boulton and Watt's engines was monumental. Coal consumption dropped, profits soared, and entire industries were revolutionised. It's hard to overstate just how pivotal their contributions were. They didn't just ride the wave of the Industrial Revolution, they helped create the tidal force behind it. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with these changes. The Luddites, those charming folks who preferred their looms without a sight of steam, saw the engines as a threat to their livelihoods and occasionally took to smashing them. Watt and Boulton had to navigate these social tensions with the finesse of a diplomat, recognizing that progress wasn't always seen as positive by everyone. In the midst of all this, Watt remained a humble, somewhat introverted genius, more at home with his drafts and diagrams than at lavish parties. Boulton, on the other hand, was the social butterfly, always ready with a handshake and a smile. Together, they balanced each other like steam and power, a partnership that was as improbable as it was successful. Their story didn't just end with steam engines. Boulton and Watt laid the groundwork for future innovations, sparking a fire of creativity and ingenuity that burned brightly into the 19th century. Their legacy was a world transformed, a narrative of progress that continues to inspire. As we leave Watt and Boulton to their industrial exploits, remember this. History isn't just a series of events, but the stories of people who dared to dream, even when those dreams seemed as intangible as steam itself. Watt's journey from a rain-soaked Scottish town to the halls of industrial fame is a testament to the power of perseverance, partnership, and a little bit of Scottish stubbornness. And as the steam engines puffed away in the background, Watt and Boulton were already setting their sights on the next big thing. But that, my friends, is a tale for another day. And speaking of the next big thing, let's dive into the whirlwind expansion of Watt's steam engine business. A saga that reads like an 18th century version of The Social Network, but with more coal and fewer hoodies. By the late 1770s, Boulton and Watt were not just a household name. They were the power behind the curtain, driving the Industrial Revolution with the fervour of a caffeine-fueled startup. So, how exactly did these steam engines change the game? Picture this. Before Watt's innovations, the Newcomen engine was like a gas guzzler from the 70s. Enter Watt's design, and suddenly you have an eco-friendly hybrid. Well, eco-friendly by 18th century standards. His engines were cutting coal consumption by a whopping 75%, which was nothing short of miraculous in an era when coal was the lifeblood of industry. This not only reduced operational costs, but also made steam power accessible to a wider range of industries, from textiles to breweries and beyond. Now, let's talk money. Because, let's face it, that's what makes the world go round. The economic boom triggered by Boulton and Watt's engines was akin to striking oil. Factories that adopted their steam engines saw production costs plummet and profits soar. In the Midlands, for instance, textile mills using steam power were able to churn out goods at an unprecedented rate, fueling a consumer boom that had shopkeepers grinning like Cheshire cats. But Watt wasn't exactly the poster child for the celebrity inventor. Unlike the Instagram influencers of today, Watt approached fame with the enthusiasm of a cat at bath time. He was more interested in perfecting his engines than in basking in the limelight. Yet, as his engines continued to revolutionize industries, Watt found himself thrust into the spotlight, albeit reluctantly. His name became synonymous with innovation, and while he might have preferred to stay in the shadows, history had other plans. Now, onto the spicy patent battles, where innovation meets litigation in a dance as old as time. Boulton and Watt's patent for the separate condenser was a hot ticket, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. Patent infringement cases were as common as tea breaks, and defending their intellectual property was a full-time job. They faced competitors who were as crafty as they were ambitious, eager to replicate their success without the pesky business of paying royalties. The courtroom dramas that ensued were as theatrical as any West End production. Imagine Watt, a man more comfortable with gears and pistons, being dragged into legal battles that made law and order look like child's play. Yet these patent wars were crucial for protecting their innovations and ensuring that copycats couldn't simply waltz off with their hard-earned advancements. Boulton, ever the savvy businessman, often took the lead in these legal skirmishes, employing a combination of charm, wit, and sheer determination to win the day. Amidst these legal tussles, it's important to debunk the myth of Watt as a lone genius. The romantic image of Watt single-handedly crafting the future from his workshop is appealing, sure, but it's about as accurate as a weather forecast on a Scottish summer day. The truth is, Watt's success was a team effort. Behind every genius inventor, there's a cadre of unsung heroes, engineers, financiers, and craftsmen who make the magic happen. In Watt's case, this included the likes of Boulton, who was the business brains, and a dedicated team of workers at the Soho manufactory. In fact, the broader industrial landscape of the time was a veritable ecosystem of collaboration and competition. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just Watt's brainchild, it was a collective movement powered by countless inventors, entrepreneurs, and labourers, all striving toward progress. Watt's engines were a crucial piece of the puzzle, but they were just one part of a much larger picture, one that saw Britain transform from a nation of manual labour to a powerhouse of mechanised industry. But not everyone was cheering from the sidelines. The steam engine's rise to prominence had a darker side too. The economic boom it fueled was accompanied by social upheaval, as traditional craftspeople found themselves outpaced by machines. The Luddites, those infamous machine smashers, saw steam power not as a marvel of engineering, but as a threat to their livelihoods. This tension between progress and preservation is a tale as old as time, and Watt's engines were right at the heart of it. For all his genius, Watt himself was acutely aware of these societal impacts. He understood that his inventions were reshaping the world, for better or worse. While he was proud of his contributions to industry, he was also a man of conscience, keenly aware of the human cost of progress. In a letter to a friend, he once mused about the potential downsides of mechanization, proving that even in the age of steam, the question of technology's role in society was as pressing as ever. As we leave Watt and his steam-powered empire for now, it's clear that his legacy is as complex as the engines he built. He was a reluctant celebrity, a defender of patents, and part of a collaborative effort that changed the world. His story is one of innovation, yes, but also of the challenges that come with it. Challenges that resonate even today as we grapple with the rapid pace of technological change. But hold on to your hats, because the story isn't over. Watt's engines were just the beginning, a spark that would ignite further innovations and societal shifts. In our next chapter, we'll explore how Watt's legacy continued to shape the industrial world long after his engines first puffed to life. Until then, remember that history is more than just the sum of its parts. It's a living, breathing tapestry of human ambition, ingenuity, and, occasionally, a dash of steam. As we dive into the twilight of James Watt's life, imagine a man who, despite his monumental contributions to industry, was far from the dashing figure of an inventor you might expect. Watt, in his later years, was more inclined to putter around his garden than to put up with the relentless grind of the industrial scene. By 1800 he officially retired from the hustle and bustle, leaving the day-to-day operations to his son, James Watt Jr., and his trusty partner, Matthew Boulton, who was also winding down his involvement. But Watt's retirement was anything but conventional. This was a man who didn't just sit back in a rocking chair with a cup of tea, though, being a Scotsman, he likely would have preferred a wee dram of whiskey. Now, before you picture Watt as a doddering old man, content with his past glories, let's delve into his post-retirement hobbies. Watt wasn't the sort to just fade into obscurity. He had a penchant for creating miniature landscapes, tiny worlds sculpted with a precision one would expect from a maestro of steam engines. Imagine Watt, the mighty industrialist, now fussing over miniature trees and meticulously crafted hills, like some 18th century model railway enthusiast. It was a hobby that might seem quaint, perhaps even eccentric, but it speaks volumes about his enduring curiosity and attention to detail. One of Watt's lesser-known contributions to the world of engineering was the Watt linkage, an invention designed not for global domination, but for the more modest purpose of creating a straight-line motion. This little piece of genius was crucial for steam engines, allowing them to produce a smooth, linear movement without the need for complex and cumbersome mechanisms. The Watt linkage wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a testament to Watt's knack for solving practical problems with elegant simplicity. Even today, engineers tip their hats to Watt's ingenuity, as the linkage remains a staple in machinery design. But let's not get too caught up in the romance of Watt's genius without a nod to reality. The myth of Watt as a solitary inventor, conjuring magic from steam, is as appealing as it is misleading. His success was built on collaboration, on the backs of countless workers and craftsmen who toiled to bring his designs to life. And let's not forget the economic context that enabled his rise. An era of burgeoning industry, where the demand for efficiency was skyrocketing faster than a steam-powered locomotive. The Industrial Revolution was a double-edged sword. While Watt's engines powered progress, they also contributed to the social upheavals of the time. The shift from agrarian societies to industrial powerhouses was as jarring as it was transformative. Cities swelled with workers, factories belched smoke, and the gap between rich and poor widened like a chasm. Watt was acutely aware of this dichotomy, and while he took pride in his contributions, he understood the complexity of progress. In a letter to a fellow inventor, he once mused about the paradox of innovation, acknowledging that every technological leap came with its own set of consequences. Watt's legacy is more than just a chapter in the history of steam power. It's a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of improvement. His name, immortalized in the unit of power known as the watt, serves as a constant reminder of his impact. But Watt, the man, was more than his engines. He was a thinker, a tinkerer, and, above all, a problem solver. His life was a tapestry woven with threads of innovation, collaboration, and a touch of Scottish stubbornness. As we reflect on Watt's contributions, it's crucial to remember the world he helped shape. His engines did more than power factories, they powered dreams. The Industrial Revolution unleashed a wave of possibility, transforming societies and economies in a way that set the stage for the modern world. And while Watt's engines may no longer be the driving force of industry, their legacy lives on in every innovation that followed. In the end, Watt's story is a reminder that history is not just about the grand narratives, but also the small details, the quiet moments of inspiration, the collaborations that spark revolutions, and the human stories behind the machines. As we close the book on Watt's life, let's do so with a nod to the complexities and contradictions of progress, and an appreciation for the men and women who dared to dream in the age of steam. Thus, as the steam engines of history chug along, remember that Watt's legacy is more than just a story of industrial might, it's a story of human aspiration and the relentless march toward a better future. So, next time you flick on a light switch or charge your phone, spare a thought for James Watt, the man who helped power the world, one ingenious invention at a time. Helen Keller's story kicks off in the sleepy town of Tuscumbia, Alabama, a place that's as far removed from the hustle and bustle of today's world as you can get. It's June 27, 1880, and the Kellers have just welcomed a new baby girl into their world. They probably weren't thinking, hey, we'd just given birth to a future icon, but life has a funny way of pulling the rug out from under our expectations. Helen was born into a family with a pedigree as old as America itself. Her father, Arthur H. Keller, was a former Confederate officer, which is a polite way of saying he was on the losing side of the Civil War. The Kellers were a Southern family through and through, with deep roots and deeper pockets, though the latter were perhaps not as deep as they'd like everyone to believe. Arthur worked as an editor for the local newspaper, the North Alabamian, which sounds about as thrilling as it was. But it paid the bills and kept the family in the genteel poverty that Southern aristocrats of the time were accustomed to. Now, Helen's mum, Kate Adams Keller, was a formidable woman in her own right. She was a second cousin to Robert E. Lee, which, in Southern social circles, was the equivalent of having royalty in your bloodline. Their family's background is like a slice of pecan pie, rich, layered, and a tad nutty. But let's not get too distracted by genealogy. Life was ticking along nicely, until tragedy struck when Helen was just 19 months old. An illness, referred to as an acute congestion of the stomach and brain by her doctors, robbed her of her sight and hearing. The specifics of the illness are a bit fuzzy, which is a recurring theme in 19th century medical records. It was probably scarlet fever or meningitis, but the doctors back then were about as precise as a weather forecast for a summer in the south. Losing 2 senses would be a crushing blow to anyone, let alone a toddler who hadn't even gotten the hang of walking yet. But if you're expecting me to say that little Helen Keller was the picture of serenity and acceptance, well, this ain't that kind of story. Helen was furious. Imagine dealing with a toddler's tantrums. Now make it so the toddler can't see or hear. The Kellers quickly discovered their daughter had a will like iron and a temper to match. The house was often filled with the sounds of smashed plates and upended furniture. To say Helen was difficult is like saying a hurricane is a bit breezy. She was a force of nature. Her family, understandably, struggled to manage her outbursts. They tried everything they could think of, which, in the 1880s, wasn't much. They even considered sending her to an asylum, which was about as pleasant as it sounds. Fortunately, they decided against it, perhaps realizing that institutional life would snuff out whatever spark was left in their daughter. Instead, they soldiered on, trying to find ways to communicate with Helen. It was a bit like playing charades with someone who hadn't read the rulebook. They developed a few rudimentary signs, but it was like trying to build an airplane with paper clips and chewing gum. The Kellers were out of their depth and desperately needed a miracle. Or, more realistically, they needed someone who knew what they were doing. Enter Anne Sullivan, but not quite yet. She's still a few paragraphs away. For now, imagine the Kellers in their parlour, probably a bit worn out, trying to keep up with a child who seemed to have an unending supply of energy and frustration. Young Helen was determined to understand her world no matter how much it had shrunk. Her tantrums were as much an expression of that determination as they were of her confusion and anger. The Kellers' handling of their daughter's temper tantrums might seem comical in hindsight, like a slapstick routine played out in the drawing rooms of Alabama. But it also highlights a key part of Helen's story, her resilience and the indomitable will that would later become legendary. Even before she could communicate, Helen was fighting to be heard, seen, and understood. She was the storm before the calm, setting the stage for one of history's most remarkable transformations. So here we have Helen Keller, a tiny titan in a world gone dark and silent, her family teetering on the edge of despair, and a world that had yet to meet one of its most unlikely heroes. All that remained was for someone to light the spark of understanding. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's plenty more to this story, and it's just getting started. And speaking of lighting sparks, it seems like the universe finally decided to cut the Kellers a break in March 1887 when Anne Sullivan entered the scene. If life were a stage play, and let's face it, sometimes it feels like it, Anne would be the character who bursts through the door carrying the plot twist in her handbag. Born on April 14, 1866, in Feeding Hills, Massachusetts, Anne had her own set of challenges. She was partially blind due to trachoma, an eye disease that sounds as unpleasant as it is. But adversity was the grit that polished Anne's resolve. By the time she was 14, she had managed to snag a spot at the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. Now, the Perkins School wasn't just any institution, it was the Ivy League of its kind. While Anne was there, she had eye operations that restored some of her vision. Not entirely, but enough to see the world with a clarity that went beyond mere eyesight. Fast forward to 1887, and here she was, a freshly minted graduate sent to tame the wild, metaphorical beast that was Helen Keller. The Kellers were desperate for a miracle, and Anne, armed with nothing but determination and a suitcase of hand-me-down clothes, was ready to give it her best shot. Anne's arrival at Ivy Green, the Keller family estate, was like a storm rolling into town. She brought with her a teaching style that was as unorthodox as it was effective. You see, Anne wasn't much for the soft-gloved approach. Her methods were more tough love than gentle persuasion, a strategy that would make modern child-rearing experts clutch their pearls. On day one, she had already decided that Helen needed discipline and structure. two things as foreign to the young girl as sight and sound. Their initial encounters were nothing short of legendary. Anne and Helen's interactions were a bit like a high-stakes chess match, each move calculated, each counter-move anticipated. It was a battle of wills, with Helen's tantrums going full tilt against Anne's patience. But Anne was no pushover. She'd dealt with her own fair share of life's curveballs, and wasn't about to be outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old with a penchant for chaos. Anne quickly realized she needed to break through the barrier of silence and darkness that surrounded Helen. Her plan? A radical approach involving the manual alphabet. Anne would spell words into Helen's hand, hoping to create a bridge between the abstract world of thoughts and the tangible reality of language. It was the educational equivalent of trying to build a skyscraper with a hammer and a few nails. At first, Helen was more interested in slapping Anne's hands away than in learning, but Anne was persistent, if nothing else. The turning point came at a water pump, a humble piece of technology that became the stage for one of history's most famous epiphanies. On an otherwise ordinary day in April, Anne took Helen to the pump and started spelling WAATER into her hand while splashing the cool liquid over it. Suddenly, something clicked for Helen. It was as if someone had flipped a switch in her brain. She finally grasped that the movements in her hand represented the wet stuff pouring over it. This was the moment Helen Keller's world cracked open, and it was all thanks to Anne's relentless dedication. This breakthrough wasn't just a minor victory, it was a seismic shift. Helen went from being a child trapped in a sensory void to one who understood that everything had a name. In a matter of hours, she demanded to know the names of everything around her. By nightfall, she had learned 30 new words. It was like watching someone unlock a treasure chest of knowledge with a key they didn't even know they had. Of course, this isn't to say that life became a breeze for Helen and Anne. Far from it. Integrating Helen into the world of language was a marathon, not a sprint. But the water pump moment was the catalyst they needed. It's easy to romanticize the story, imagining a serene scene with birds chirping in the background, but let's not kid ourselves. The reality was a lot messier, filled with sweat, tears, and probably a few choice words muttered under Anne's breath. In the days that followed, Anne and Helen's relationship evolved from a power struggle to a partnership. Anne was a taskmaster, sure, but she was also a mentor, a guide, and, perhaps most importantly, a friend. She understood that Helen needed more than just facts. She needed someone who believed in her potential. Anne's teaching methods were innovative, to say the least. She used everyday experiences to impart lessons, turning the world into a classroom without walls. As revolutionary as Anne's methods were, they were also deeply personal. She wasn't just teaching Helen about the world, she was teaching Helen to navigate it on her own terms. This wasn't about making Helen fit into society's mold, it was about helping her carve out her own unique space within it. And that's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. The journey from chaos to communication wasn't an overnight success. It was a gradual unfolding, like watching a flower bloom in slow motion, but once the process started, there was no stopping it. Helen was hungry for knowledge, and Anne was there to feed her curiosity. Together they were unstoppable, proving that sometimes the most unyielding barriers are the ones we construct for ourselves. As we leave Helen and Anne at the beginning of their incredible journey, remember this, their story is far from over. There's a world to explore, challenges to overcome, and myths to bust. So, stick around, because the roller coaster ride of Helen Keller's life is just picking up speed. And so, the roller coaster of Helen Keller's life begins its next thrilling ascent, taking us to the hallowed halls of education. Now, if you think Helen's journey to formal schooling was a walk in the park, you're due for a reality check. It was more like trekking through a jungle with Anne Sullivan wielding the machete. Formal education for a deaf-blind girl in the late 19th century was about as common as a smartphone in a Victorian drawing room. But Helen, with Anne by her side, was determined to rewrite the rulebook. First stop, the Perkins Institute for the Blind. Founded in 1829, Perkins was a pioneer in the field of education for the visually impaired, a beacon of hope for many. It was here that Helen began her formal education in 1888. Not to get too technical, but Perkins was like the Hogwarts of its time for those who couldn't see or, in Helen's case, also couldn't hear. Imagine arriving at a place where everyone else was already an expert in overcoming at least one of your challenges. It was both daunting and exhilarating. Helen's time at Perkins was a whirlwind of learning. She was like a sponge, soaking up every bit of knowledge she could grasp. While most kids were busy trying to avoid homework, Helen was relentless in her pursuit of education. She had a knack for languages, picking up French and Latin as if they were just more words to spell out in her palm. And let's not forget her literary prowess. She devoured books like they were going out of style. By the time she was a teenager, she had read the likes of Shakespeare, Dickens, and even some Greek philosophers. Her mind was a steel trap, ready to spring open at the slightest hint of new information. But as Helen's education advanced, so did the skeptics. You see, the world was having a hard time wrapping its head around the idea that a deaf-blind girl could actually excel academically. They might as well have been asked to believe in unicorns. The skepticism was almost comical, like watching someone try to deny gravity while standing on the ground. People couldn't quite fathom that Helen was legitimately brilliant, and not just the result of a talented teacher whispering answers in her ear. Ironically, Anne Sullivan must have chuckled at the idea of whispering anything to Helen. Even with the naysayers lurking, Helen was just getting started. By the time she was ready for college, she had already achieved more than most people do in a lifetime. But Helen had her sights set on Radcliffe College, the women's counterpart to the then all-male Harvard College. Now, getting into Radcliffe was no small feat. It was like trying to break into Fort Knox, but Helen wasn't one to be deterred by a little thing like impossibility. In 1900, she became the first deaf-blind person to be admitted to the prestigious institution, a place known more for its ivory towers than for its accessibility accommodations. Radcliffe wasn't exactly a cakewalk. It was more like an obstacle course on steroids. Imagine trying to keep up with lectures when you can't hear them and need someone to fingerspell them into your hand. Anne Sullivan was there every step of the way, a steadfast companion who translated lectures and textbooks into Helen's hands. But let's be honest, even with Anne's help, it was like trying to drink from a fire hose. Helen had to work twice as hard as her peers just to keep up, and yet she thrived. Alongside her academic pursuits, Helen's college years were peppered with intriguing encounters, not least with the legendary Mark Twain. Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens, was a man who had seen the world and then some. He was as sharp as his wit, which was saying something. Twain met Helen at a luncheon in New York, and the two hit it off immediately. He was charmed by her intelligence and tenacity, famously dubbing her the eighth wonder of the world. Considering the man was known for his biting commentary, this was high praise indeed. Twain was more than just an admirer. He became a great supporter of Helen's education. When she faced financial difficulties at Radcliffe, Twain introduced her to his friend Henry Huddleston Rogers, a magnate who made his fortune in oil, railroads, and other industries. Rogers, in turn, helped cover Helen's college expenses, proving that sometimes it pays to know the right people. It's a lesson in networking that even LinkedIn would envy. Despite all the support, Helen's college experience wasn't without its challenges. The academic world was still skeptical of her abilities, often scrutinizing her work more than that of her peers. It was as if they were waiting for her to falter, ready to declare her success a fluke. But Helen had an unyielding spirit, and she didn't just want to meet expectations, she wanted to shatter them. In 1904, she graduated cum laude, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Her story was a mic-drop moment, if ever there was one. Yet, the world still couldn't quite shake its disbelief. The idea that a woman, let alone a deaf-blind one, could achieve such academic heights was almost scandalous. Helen was living proof that society's limitations were often self-imposed. Her life was a constant reminder that the barriers we face are often the ones we construct ourselves. And if that's not a lesson worth learning, I don't know what is. So, as Helen moved forward, armed with her education and an indomitable spirit, she was poised to take on the world. Her story was far from over, and the challenges ahead would only fuel her determination. She was ready to show the world what true resilience looked like, and the world, whether it was ready or not, was about to find out. Stay tuned, because the Helen Keller saga still has plenty of chapters left to unfold. Now, with a freshly minted degree and a mission that could rival any action hero's, Helen Keller was ready to dive headfirst into the world of advocacy. and let me tell you, she wasn't exactly dipping her toes into the kiddie pool. No, Helen was more like a cannonballer who'd just spotted the deep end. Her first big splash, the American Foundation for the Blind, AFB. Founded in 1921, this organization was like the Justice League, but for people with visual impairments. Helen joined the AFB in 1924, bringing with her a background that was as impressive as it was unconventional. Imagine the board meetings. You have the usual suspects, professionals in suits, discussing budgets and outreach, and then there's Helen, the wild card who'd already shattered societal expectations. Her presence was like throwing a live grenade into a room full of complacency. She was there to shake things up, and let's be real, things desperately needed shaking. At the time, approximately 200,000 Americans were blind, and resources were scarcer than a snowstorm in July. The AFB aimed to change that, and Helen was all in. Helen's work with the AFB was nothing short of revolutionary. She didn't just show up to smile and wave for the cameras. She was a tireless advocate, travelling over 40,000 miles in a single year during the 1940s to promote the Foundation's mission. Talk about dedication. If frequent flyer miles had been a thing back then, Helen could have circled the globe multiple times. Her speeches were as fiery as a southern barbecue, calling for better education and employment opportunities for the blind. She wasn't just raising awareness, she was raising the bar. But Helen's advocacy didn't stop at visual impairments. Oh no, she had her eyes, metaphorically speaking, set on a much broader horizon. Into the realm of political activism. Helen was a staunch socialist, which was about as popular in early 20th century America as a skunk at a garden party. To say she ruffled feathers would be an understatement. She was more like a tornado in a henhouse, leaving high society in a tizzy over her radical beliefs. You see, Helen's socialism wasn't just a casual dabble, it was a full-on commitment. She believed deeply in workers' rights, women's suffrage, and, brace yourselves, the abolishment of capitalism. High society was scandalized, clutching their pearls as if they might faint from the shock. This was the same Helen Keller they'd applauded for her academic achievements and plucky spirit, suddenly transformed into a political firebrand. It was as if the nation's darling had suddenly started advocating for free-range unicorns. But Helen wasn't fazed. She wasn't interested in being a quiet, compliant role model. She was interested in justice and equity, and if that meant shaking up the status quo, so be it. In 1912, she joined the Socialist Party of America and began advocating for the rights of workers and the poor. Her pamphlet, Why I Became a Socialist, was a call to arms, and her articles in magazines like The New York Call made it clear she wasn't backing down. She was like a literary pugilist, punching through the paper with her words. Helen's political activism extended beyond American borders too. She was a world traveller, visiting 39 countries from Europe to Asia, and everywhere she went she championed the rights of the disadvantaged. Picture it, Helen Keller, the woman who couldn't hear or see, standing on stages around the world, delivering speeches that resonated with audiences in multiple languages. She was nothing short of a global sensation. During her travels, Helen met with world leaders, including Winston Churchill and Jawaharlal Nehru. She wasn't just a guest of honor, she was an influencer before that was even a term. Her presence was a powerful reminder of the universal nature of human struggle and resilience. Her speeches challenged not only societal norms, but also the very essence of what it meant to be human. She asked questions that were as uncomfortable as they were necessary. What does it mean to be truly free? Who deserves a voice in society? And let's not forget the humor in all this. Helen often joked about her own radical beliefs, quipping that she must be a red, because she was always seeing red whenever she observed injustice. Her wit was as sharp as her vision was impaired, and her ability to poke fun at herself while dismantling oppressive systems was nothing short of genius. She had a knack for making people laugh while simultaneously making them think, a combination that left her audiences both entertained and introspective. But despite her high-profile activism and undeniable charisma, Helen faced her share of critics. Some accused her of being manipulated by others, unable to form her own opinions. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Apparently, people who couldn't see or hear weren't supposed to have thoughts of their own. But Helen, ever the trailblazer, dismissed these criticisms with the same ease with which she dismissed societal limitations. She was a force of nature, and nothing was going to stop her from advocating for what she believed in. Helen Keller's advocacy work, both with the AFB and in the political arena, was more than just a footnote in history. It was a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that limitations are often just illusions. Her life was a masterclass in resilience and determination, a saga that continues to inspire generations. So, while Helen may have been born into a world of silence and darkness, she spent her life creating light and sound in ways that resonate to this day. Stay tuned, because Helen Keller's legacy is far from finished. The next part of her story promises to be just as compelling, and you won't want to miss it. So, Helen Keller's legacy, much like a sturdy oak tree, has branches reaching far and wide. But let's clear away the ivy of myth to see the solid trunk of reality. First, the legend, Helen Keller, the deaf-blind girl turned inspirational icon, a woman who overcame insurmountable odds to spread light in a world she couldn't see or hear. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Cue the harp music and angelic choirs. The reality, though, is a tad less angelic and a lot more human. Helen Keller was no saintly figure cloaked in perpetual triumph. She was a complex, sometimes controversial, individual who defied not just physical limitations, but also societal expectations about what someone like her was supposed to be. It's a classic case of the legend overshadowing the messy, gritty reality, which, let's face it, is far more interesting. For starters, Helen was an outspoken advocate for socialism and workers' rights, a stance that made her less popular in certain circles than a skunk at a garden party. Imagine the collective gasp of early 20th century high society when their beloved Helen started railing against capitalism and advocating for labour unions. She may have been America's sweetheart, but she wasn't about to let that stop her from speaking her mind. Her political activism was as much a part of her identity as her advocacy for the disabled, yet it gets swept under the rug in favour of the more palatable, sanitized version of her story. And then there's the question of how Helen managed to accomplish so much. The romantic narrative suggests she did it all through sheer will and determination, like a superhero in period dress. But let's not forget Anne Sullivan, Helen's indomitable teacher and lifelong companion, who was as crucial to Helen's success as the wings to an airplane. Anne's role in Helen's life was monumental, yet she often plays second fiddle in the Helen Keller myth. In reality, their partnership was a testament to the power of collaboration. Two minds working in tandem to shatter the glass ceilings of their time. Helen's impact on disability rights is another area where myth and reality collude. The myth is that she single-handedly revolutionized the way society views and treats the disabled. The reality is more nuanced. Helen was indeed a pioneering figure, but she was also part of a broader movement. She wasn't out there solo with a megaphone, she was part of a chorus advocating for change. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and other landmark legislation owe as much to the collective efforts of countless advocates as they do to Helen's trailblazing work. Yet the myths persist, because, let's face it, romantic narratives are comforting. They offer a tidy package, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, where good triumphs over adversity. Reality, on the other hand, is as unpredictable as a cat on a hot tin roof. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society and ourselves, and that's a tall order for anyone seeking a bedtime story. Speaking of uncomfortable truths, Helen's later years were not the idyllic retirement one might imagine for a national icon. The reality was a bit more Dickensian. Despite her fame, Helen faced financial difficulties later in life, relying on speaking engagements to make ends meet. Her financial struggles were a stark reminder that even the most celebrated figures are not immune to the harsh economic realities of their time. The fact that someone like Helen Keller had to worry about money is as ironic as it is tragic, highlighting the societal shortcomings in valuing contributions that aren't easily quantified in dollars and cents. Helen Keller passed away in 1968 at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy as complicated and multifaceted as the woman herself. Her life was a mosaic of triumphs and trials, a testament to human resilience and the relentless pursuit of knowledge and justice. But remember, the true power of Helen Keller's legacy lies not in the myths we tell, but in the reality she lived. A reality that continues to inspire and challenge us to see beyond the surface, to listen beyond the noise, and to feel deeply, even when the world insists on remaining numb. So, next time you think of Helen Keller, resist the urge to box her into the neat little narrative of overcoming adversity. Instead, remember her as she truly was, a firebrand, a disruptor, and a pioneer who refused to let society dictate her story. She was a woman who turned the world upside down, not through miraculous feats, but through relentless determination and an unwavering belief in the power of human potential. Now, if that doesn't make you sit up and take notice, I don't know what will. Here's to Helen Keller, a legend in her own right, not because of the myths, but because of the reality she forged, one indomitable step at a time. You're lying there on your straw-stuffed mattress, which, let's be honest, is more lump than comfort, but it beats the hard ground. The hall around you, drafty and dim, is a testament to 8th century architectural priorities, namely, keeping the rain out, but not the cold. You're a Saxon leader, so at least you've got a roof over your head, unlike old Ethelbert down the road, whose hut would make a hedgehog feel exposed. The sun's barely making an appearance, just an orange smudge against the horizon. But that doesn't mean you can hit the snooze button. It's time to rise and shine, or at least rise and tolerate. Breakfast isn't going to eat itself, and neither are you if you're expecting bacon on the menu today. Spoiler alert, you're not. The Anglo-Saxon economy, fascinatingly, didn't run on a steady supply of bacon. Pigs were valuable, not just for their deliciousness, but as a walking, grunting form of wealth. So, you'll probably start your day with a slab of bread, maybe some ale, because water? That's for the Romans. The economic reality of breakfast in the 8th century is a bit of a sobering thought, isn't it? You're a leader, sure, but unless you're King Offa himself, you're not exactly swimming in luxury. You've got to balance your books, such as they are, and that means understanding the true value of what's on your plate or in your cup. Ale was the breakfast of champions, or at least the breakfast of everyone, because it was safer than that dubious water source you call a river. Now, let's talk wardrobe. You wish you could just throw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, but your morning ensemble is a bit more intricate. You're reaching for a tunic, probably wool, because practicality trumps style in this era. It's not flashy, but it keeps you warm, which is important when your hall is basically a wind tunnel. And don't forget the belt. After all, you need somewhere to hang your sea-axe, the trusty knife that's part tool, part weapon, and all status symbol. In a world where fashion statements are more about survival than style, you've got to make do with what you've got. Dressing for the day in the 8th century is a tactile reminder that you're living in a time when textiles are a labor-intensive luxury. Every piece of clothing is a product of countless hours of spinning, weaving, and dyeing. You might feel a pang of envy for the nobles who can afford imported silks, but those are few and far between, and you're more likely to see the inside of a monastery than a mercantile ship from Byzantium. With breakfast settled and your tunic adjusted, it's time to face the day. The morning assembly awaits, not just a gathering to gripe about the weather, which is predictably gloomy, but a political chessboard where every move counts. Here, alliances are forged, disputes are settled, and, if you're clever, your position as a leader is solidified. It's all about the optics, even in the 8th century. You're not just managing a household, you're managing a micro-kingdom. Every decision you make ripples through your community, affecting everyone from the highest thing to the lowest seal. You've got to balance the needs of your people with the demands of your neighbours, and sometimes that means playing the long game. Your goal is to keep everyone, well, almost everyone, reasonably content. You're not going to please Bede's ghost, and frankly, you've got bigger fish to fry. Speaking of fish, you might need to negotiate some fishing rights before someone else does. It's all about the give and take, and you've got to be sure you're giving less than you take. As you walk into the assembly, you're greeted by the familiar faces of your fellow leaders, each with their own agenda. You nod to Oswin, your neighbour to the east, who's been eyeing a patch of your woodland for weeks. You're not about to give it up without a fight, well, preferably a metaphorical one. Here, diplomacy is your weapon of choice. The gathering is a mix of formality and informality. You're discussing land disputes, grain allocations, and, of course, the weather. It's a subject that never fails to elicit groans, but it's also a reminder of your reliance on the whims of nature. A good harvest can mean prosperity, while a bad one spells trouble. It's an exercise in controlled chaos, where you've got to listen more than you speak, and speak only when you've got something worth saying. The morning assembly isn't just about politics, though. It's a social hub where news is exchanged, rumours are spread, and occasionally a bit of gossip slips through. You've got to keep your ears open and your wits about you, because the information you gather here could be the key to your next big decision. As the assembly wraps up, you're feeling a bit more grounded, if not exactly optimistic. You've set the wheels in motion for the day, and now it's time to see where they take you. The sun's a bit higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the hall, and you know that the rest of the day will be filled with tasks, challenges, and maybe a bit of unexpected drama. But that's life in the 8th century. A balancing act between survival and strategy, where every choice matters and every day is a new chapter in the story of your leadership. Now that you've survived the morning assembly, let's get into the nitty-gritty of Saxon leadership meetings. Forget those grandiose images of eloquent speeches and gallant knights. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood epic. It's the 8th century, where words are more precious than gold, because they can save you from losing a cow or two. Speaking of which, cows are a hot commodity. They're not just walking steaks, they're the currency of choice in this pastoral economy. In fact, the average cow could be worth up to 240 silver pennies, which was nothing to snort at. So, when you're in these meetings, you're not just exchanging pleasantries, you're bartering future meals and the well-being of your community. The council gatherings lean more towards strategic alliances and less towards fiery orations. Picture a chess game, but with more mud and fewer rooks. You're not trying to impress the room with flowery language, you're out to secure your dominion against rivals, both seen and unseen. It's about who you know, who owes you a favour, and who you can trust with your back turned. The Saxon world is a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, and your job is to stitch your piece into this quilt without it unravelling. That means alliances over antagonism, even if you have to smile at someone you'd rather see washed away by the next flood. When it comes to making deals, tribute payments are your bread and butter. Or perhaps your bread and ale, since we've established that water is far too Roman for your tastes. Tribute is the grease in the wheels of Saxon politics, a token of loyalty, respect, and sometimes, let's be honest, a bit of extortion. You're not just accepting goods out of the kindness of your heart, you're asserting dominance. A well-timed gift or payment can turn a potential rival into a begrudging ally. It's a delicate dance of power, where each party knows the steps but hopes to lead. You're bartering peace with livestock and grain, and sometimes a well-crafted axe or two. Now, let's tackle the myth of noble diplomacy. The idea that these gatherings were filled with noble intentions and pure-hearted negotiations is as flimsy as a straw hut in a gale. Sure, there's a bit of ceremony, handshakes, nods, maybe even a toast, but beneath it all is a gritty reality. It's a world where power struggles are as common as rain in England. You've got to navigate through a maze of egos and ambitions, each as prickly as a hedgehog. Forget the notion of chivalry, this is about survival, plain and simple. You're not here to win friends. You're here to not lose enemies. Each council meeting is a microcosm of the larger Saxon economy. The exchanges and decisions made here ripple outwards, impacting trade, agriculture, and the everyday lives of the people. You're not just debating over land and livestock, you're shaping the economic landscape. A decision to increase grain tribute from a village can mean the difference between feast and famine for its inhabitants. Every choice you make is a gamble, with stakes as high as the tallest Saxon longship. As you sit in these meetings, you're reminded that leadership isn't for the faint of heart or the soft of stomach. You've got to have the guts to make hard decisions and the brains to predict their outcomes. It's as much about reading people as it is about reading the land. You've got to be a strategist, a diplomat, and occasionally a bit of a trickster. Because in the end, it's not just about keeping your seat at the table, it's about making sure that table doesn't get flipped over. The myth of the wise and benevolent leader is a comforting bedtime story, but the reality is much more complex. It's a balancing act, where every decision sways the scales between prosperity and ruin. You're not just a figurehead, you're a linchpin holding your community together in a world that's always threatening to fall apart. So as the morning sun rises higher, casting its light over your realm, you're keenly aware that every meeting, every deal, every tribute paid or accepted is a thread in the fabric of your people's survival. And as you head into the rest of the day, you know that this tapestry is far from finished. There are more threads to weave, more stories to shape, and more challenges to face. But for now, you face this morning's assembly and come out with your dignity and your cows intact. As you stroll away from the morning assembly, mentally tallying your victories and grudges, you can practically hear your stomach growling like a Saxon war cry. Time for lunch, or, as it's known in your world, a much-needed break from the endless political wrangling. But don't get too excited. This isn't a lavish affair with silver platters and exotic spices. It's more like a slightly improved breakfast bread, cheese, maybe some salted fish if you're feeling fancy. The 8th century menu is nothing if not consistent. Remember, your pantry doesn't come stocked with neatly packaged goods from the local supermarket. Your food supply chain is a bit more hands-on. It starts with the fields and ends at your feasting table, with plenty of dirt and sweat in between. As a Saxon leader, it's your job to ensure this chain doesn't snap. And trust me, keeping everyone fed is no small feat when your backup plan is hoping the neighbour's chickens wander into your yard. Managing the agriculture in your domain is like playing a never-ending game of chess. You've got to think 3 moves ahead, anticipating both the whims of nature and the unpredictability of your fellow humans. You're not just growing crops, you're growing a community survival plan. Wheat, barley, oats. These aren't just grains, they're lifelines. A bad harvest doesn't just mean fewer loaves on the table, it's a potential disaster that can ripple through every corner of your life. When you're not sweating over land disputes, you're strategizing how to get the most out of every acre, because every kernel counts. Now, let's talk about feasts. In your world, a feast isn't just about stuffing your face with whatever's available. It's a political tool, a way to cement alliances and ensure loyalty. Nothing says, please don't invade my lands, like a big spread of roasted meats and endless cups of ale. But here's the kicker. These feasts are your responsibility. You've got to make sure there's enough food to go around. No small task when your grocery list includes items that have to be grown, hunted, or bartered for months in advance. And then there's the hygiene, or lack thereof. Let's just say your ancestors weren't exactly culinary perfectionists. Forget about modern health standards. This is the era where flavour often comes with a side of questionable practices. A bit of dirt on the veggies adds texture. All that's been sitting out a while? It's aged, like fine wine. The truth is, hygiene was a luxury few could afford, and meals could be memorable for all the wrong reasons. But hey, it builds character, right? The logistics of feeding your community are as complex as any battle plan. You've got to juggle the needs of the present with the uncertainties of the future. Store too little, and you're facing hunger. Store too much, and you risk spoilage. A delicate balance indeed. It's not just about what you eat today, but what you'll have tomorrow and the day after. In a world without refrigeration, preservation techniques like smoking, salting, and drying are your best friends. Master these, and you might just get through the winter without resorting to drastic measures. Feasts are also an opportunity to display wealth and power. They're your chance to show off your domain's bounty, to demonstrate that you're not just surviving, but thriving. It's a show of strength as much as it is of hospitality. But don't let the romanticized notion of the noble host fool you. There's a gritty reality behind every lavish spread. You've got to keep your guests happy, sure, but you also need to keep an eye on your reserves. After all, a feast today could mean a famine tomorrow if you're not careful. With every feast you host, you're not just feeding bellies, you're feeding relationships. You're forging connections, ensuring alliances, and sometimes subtly reminding everyone just who's in charge. It's a delicate dance of power, where every bite is a reminder of your responsibilities and your capabilities. In this world, food isn't just sustenance, it's a statement. The myth of the endless Saxon feast, with tables groaning under the weight of abundance, is as appealing as it is misleading. The reality is far more precarious. You're constantly balancing the scales between plenty and scarcity, with every decision impacting your community's future. It's a high-stakes game, where the price of failure is more than just an empty stomach. As your lunch wraps up, and you've had your fill both of food and of the weighty thoughts of leadership, you're ready to tackle the next challenge. There are still fields to inspect, disputes to mediate, and maybe, just maybe, a moment to catch your breath before the afternoon's demands take over. The sun is still climbing, and so are your responsibilities. But for now, you've managed to keep the plate spinning, and that's no small feat in the grand tapestry of Saxon life. Having nurtured your inner leader with a modest lunch, it's time to dive into the murky waters of the Saxon justice system. And trust me, it's not as clear-cut as the Hollywood version. No gavels or judges in sight. Instead, welcome to a world where justice is served with a side of livestock and a dash of creative problem-solving. Now, let's talk Vergild. Sounds like the latest fantasy novel, right? But this is far from fiction. Wergild, or man price, is the medieval equivalent of a price tag on your head calculated in silver shillings. Accidentally stepped on your neighbour's prized pig? That'll cost you. Accidentally killed your neighbour? Well, that's a bigger price, but still a price nonetheless. In fact, if you were a noble, your life could be worth up to 1,200 shillings, a small fortune in a world where a skilled craftsman might earn 30 shillings a year. This wasn't just about compensation. It was a calculated deterrent, reinforcing social hierarchy and helping to keep the peace. It's part insurance policy, part societal glue. Justice here doesn't involve a courtroom drama with a surprise witness. The Saxons had a more straightforward system, community assemblies known as moot courts. Picture a gathering of your peers sharing a pint and some exaggerated tales of you chasing a chicken. These moots were the local hubs for settling disputes, ranging from land squabbles to more serious offences. And while they might lack the drama of a gavel, they had all the drama of a neighbourhood gossip fest. The community decided your guilt, and if you were lucky, leniency was just a convincingly argued point away. But let's not romanticize this as a purely fair process. The system was, shall we say, flexible. Wealth and status often tipped the scales of justice. If you could pay your wergild, you could avoid harsher penalties. This wasn't justice for all, it was justice for those who could afford it. And while this may seem cynical, it was also an effective way to avoid blood feuds that would make the Hatfields and McCoys look like a friendly misunderstanding. Now, let's debunk the myth of the wise Saxon leader as a paragon of fairness. Sure, the allure of a wise and benevolent ruler is strong, but reality paints a more complex picture. Saxon leaders were more akin to pragmatic politicians than benevolent monarchs. They had to juggle the interests of the community, their own power, and the ever-present threat of Viking raids. Decisions weren't made from the goodness of one's heart, but often from necessity, cunning, and a keen sense of self-preservation. Creative justice was the order of the day. Instead of a one-size-fits-all punishment, leaders used a mix of fines, property redistribution, and even public humiliation to keep order. Imagine being sentenced to wear a ridiculous hat for a week as penance. It may seem absurd, but it was a way to maintain public order without resorting to harsher measures like exile or worse. One of the weirder aspects of Saxon justice was trial by ordeal. Believing that divine intervention would reveal the truth, accused individuals might be subjected to boiling water or hot iron. If you emerged unscathed, you were innocent. If not, well, you probably had more pressing concerns than guilt. It's a logic that defies modern understanding, but was rooted in a deep belief in divine justice. The Saxon justice system was nothing if not pragmatic. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about maintaining social order with the tools and beliefs at hand. And in a world where the threat of a Viking invasion was a constant spectre, keeping the peace was more about practicality than principle. Economically, this system was a double-edged sword. While vergild and fines could deter crime, they also reinforced social hierarchies. Wealthy individuals could literally pay for their transgressions, while the poor bore the brunt of harsher penalties. And in a society where livestock was currency, losing a cow could be catastrophic. This brings us to the myth of the Saxon community as an egalitarian paradise. While the idea of a close-knit community working together for the common good is appealing, the reality was far less idyllic. Social hierarchies were entrenched, and justice was often a reflection of wealth and status. The Saxon world was a rigid hierarchy, where power concentrated at the top and everyone else scrambled for their piece of the pie, or in this case, their sliver of bread. So, as you wrap up your afternoon pondering the intricacies of wergild and moot courts, remember that Saxon justice was a balancing act. It was about maintaining order, preserving power, and navigating a world where survival was a daily struggle. And while the romantic notion of a fair and just leader is appealing, the reality was a gritty blend of pragmatism and politics, where justice was less about fairness and more about keeping the peace and your place in the social order. With the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over your realm, you're reminded that peace comes at a price. It's a price paid in silver, livestock, and sometimes personal pride. But in the grand tapestry of Saxon life, It's a price worth paying to ensure stability in a world where chaos lurked just beyond the horizon. Now, let's see what the rest of the day holds. There are more tales to weave, more myths to unravel, and more history to explore. Stay tuned, because the saga of Saxon life is far from over. As dusk falls, it's not exactly the backdrop of a romanticized medieval painting, but there's a certain gritty charm to the Saxon evening. The day's labours are winding down, and the hall, still draughty and dim, is about to become a hub of social activity. It's time for the evening rituals, where you, as a Saxon leader, get to unwind, or at least pretend to while you're still strategizing for tomorrow. The fire crackles in the centre of the hall, casting flickering shadows that dance over the rough-hewn beams and the gathered faces. Here, storytelling is the main event, and it's not just for entertainment. These tales are the glue that holds your community together, a verbal tapestry that weaves history, morality, and a touch of fantasy into a narrative that's both captivating and instructive. Think of it as a medieval TED Talk, but with more dragons and fewer slideshows. Oral tradition is your Netflix, your library, and your history book all rolled into one. It's how you remember the deeds of legendary figures, like the time Beowulf supposedly wrestled the monster with his bare hands. Sure, it's probably exaggerated, but it's not about precise facts. It's about the spirit of heroism that inspires your people. These stories are your community's version of a morale boost, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, bravery and cunning can triumph. But let's not get too carried away by the allure of epic tales. While storytelling is essential for preserving history, it's also a game of telephone played over generations. Details get embellished, facts get twisted, and suddenly the humble Saxon warrior is a demigod capable of single-handedly defeating an entire Viking raiding party. It's a classic case of myth overtaking reality, but who doesn't love a good yarn with a dash of exaggeration? As you listen, you can't help but think about tomorrow. You've got plans to lay, alliances to consider, and maybe a plot or two to hatch. The Saxon world is all about long-term strategy, and every evening is another chance to ponder your next moves. This isn't just idle chit-chat. It's where you put your mental chess game into practice, anticipating the moves of your neighbours and rivals alike. And speaking of strategy, this is when you remind yourself of the economic realities that shape your decisions. In your world, resources are scarce and every choice carries weight. You're not just thinking about surviving the next Viking raid, you're balancing the needs of your people with the demands of trade, tribute, and diplomacy. It's a juggling act that makes modern-day politics look like a game of checkers. Now, let's debunk a persistent myth, the idea of the Saxon leader as a lone wolf, making decisions in isolation. In reality, leadership is a collaborative effort. You've got your trusted advisors, your family, and even your community all weighing in on the decisions that affect everyone. It's not dictatorship, it's consensus building. And while it sounds ideal, in practice, it's as messy as a spilled pot of ale. But despite the chaos, there's something deeply satisfying about the Saxon way of life. It's a world where leadership is earned through cunning and courage, not inherited through birthright alone. You've got to prove yourself every day. And while that's exhausting, it also means you're constantly honing your skills, sharpening your wits, and reinforcing your place in the social fabric. As the evening wears on, you find yourself reflecting on the legacy you're building. Leadership isn't just about maintaining power, it's about leaving a mark, crafting a story that will be told around future fires. You're part of a lineage that stretches back generations, and while your name might not be immortalized in stone, it lives on in the tales and memories of your people. And so, as you drift off to sleep on that lumpy straw mattress, you're not just closing the book on another day, you're adding another chapter to the ongoing saga of Saxon life. It's a legacy built on grit, tenacity, and a fair bit of audacity. Your realm may not be as grand as a king's, but it's yours, crafted with decisions that echo through your community like the timeless tales spun by the fire. So, as you close your eyes, you can rest knowing that tomorrow brings new stories, new challenges, and new opportunities to shape your world. In the end, it's not about the myths that linger. It's about the reality you've carved out in the heart of 8th century England, a tale of resilience, resourcefulness, and the relentless pursuit of a better tomorrow. Charlemagne's early years were less about fairy tales and more like a medieval soap opera with a sprinkle of strategic genius. Born around 742 AD, give or take a few calendar debates, he was the eldest son of Pepin the Short who, despite the name, packed quite the political punch. Pepin wasn't just any Frankish king, he was the first of the Carolingians, a dynasty that would leave its mark on Europe like a toddler with a permanent marker on a white wall. Now, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, if you're feeling formal, had a childhood shaped by the kind of family dynamics that make Thanksgiving dinners look tame. His parents, Pepin and Bertrada of Laon, were the power couple of their time. Think medieval Brangelina, but with more chainmail and fewer tabloids. They had to navigate the choppy waters of Frankish politics, where alliances were as stable as a castle made of sand and everyone was a backstabbing cousin or brother-in-law. The Frankish tradition of inheritance wasn't just a game of pass the crown. It was more like chopping a kingdom into bite-sized pieces, hoping everyone was happy with their slice. It's no wonder Pepin wanted to ensure his power stayed in the family, like a stubborn heirloom or that infamous fruitcake nobody wants. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was split between Charlemagne and his brother Charlemagne, not to be confused with a mid-tier Marvel villain. The split was supposed to be equal, but defining equal in political terms was a bit like asking two kids to share a single ice cream cone. Charlemagne and Carlomagne's territories were separated by a line that seemed more imaginary than real, like a poorly drawn map in a pirate movie. Charlemagne got the northern part, including Neustria and Austrasia, while Carloman received the southern bits with Burgundy and Provence. The logic behind these divisions was probably clear to Pepin, but to the rest of us it was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The brothers weren't exactly the medieval version of the Wonder Twins. Their relationship was tense, with more cold stares than warm embraces. Carloman, the younger of the two, might have felt like he was living in Charlemagne's shadow, which, considering Charlemagne's later reputation, was a shadow the size of a small cathedral. The tension between them was palpable, and it didn't help that their advisers were likely whispering in their ears, each pushing for their own piece of the pie. The absurdity of this situation wasn't lost on the Franks themselves. This was a time when kingdoms were as stable as a soap bubble at a sword fight. Alliances shifted quicker than the weather, and loyalty was a currency in short supply. Yet, despite the potential for a family feud that could rival any reality show, fate, or perhaps a good dose of medieval luck, intervened. Carloman died in 771, just 3 years after their father. His death was sudden, and while some might raise an eyebrow at the timing, let's not jump to conspiracy theories just yet. With Carloman out of the picture, Charlemagne saw his chance. Like a master chess player seeing an opening, he moved quickly to consolidate power. He took over his brother's lands, uniting the fragmented kingdom under his rule. It was a bold move, one that likely had his advisers sweating through their tunics. But Charlemagne wasn't just any ruler, he had a vision. And this vision was less about keeping the status quo and more about expanding his influence like a medieval Elon Musk with a penchant for land rather than rockets. Charlemagne's rise to power was not just a tale of familial maneuvering, but a strategic masterclass in political acumen. He understood the importance of alliances, marrying into powerful families and, when necessary, showing up with an army to make his point. His early reign was marked by expansion, diplomacy, and, occasionally, a little friendly persuasion with the pointy end of a sword. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality was as gritty as it was glorious. Charlemagne didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited all the problems that came with it. Rest of nobles, ambitious clergy, and a populace that needed convincing that one man could indeed hold it all together. His challenge was to forge a new identity for his realm, one that would not only survive, but thrive in the chaotic world of medieval Europe. Charlemagne's early life and rise to power were a testament to the tangled web of medieval politics, where family ties could be both a blessing and a curse. His story is a reminder that even legends are built on the messy, imperfect realities of the past. And while we might chuckle at the quirks of medieval inheritance, there's no denying that Charlemagne's ability to navigate these complexities set the stage for one of history's most impressive reigns. Charlemagne's ability to juggle medieval politics was impressive, but his real claim to fame was his appetite for conquest. Picture a medieval general with a map of Europe and a burning desire to colour it all in Frankish blue. It wasn't just vanity or thirst for power. Charlemagne saw himself as the guardian of Christendom, taking up the sword for both glory and God. But here's the kicker. These campaigns were less about gallant knights on noble steeds and more about logistical headaches that would make a supply chain manager weep. Let's dive into one of his most infamous endeavours, the Saxon Wars. This wasn't your average skirmish with a neighbouring tribe. Oh no, this was 30 years. Yes, 3 entire decades of slogging through the muddy, dense forests of northern Germany, trying to subdue a people who were about as keen on Frankish rule as a cat is on bath time. The Saxons were a fiercely independent lot with their own pagan beliefs, which didn't exactly mesh with Charlemagne's vision of a united Christian Europe. Now, calling this a war might be a bit generous. It was more like a series of exhausting campaigns punctuated by brief, uneasy truces. Think of it as the world's longest game of whack-a-mole, where every time Charlemagne thought he'd quashed the Saxon spirit, they'd pop right back up, swinging axes and refusing to baptize their babies. The Saxons knew their terrain like the back of their hands, and they used it to their advantage, making Charlemagne's troops work for every inch of land. But here's where the legend meets reality, and it's not quite the heroic tale of yore. The convert or dies policy attributed to Charlemagne wasn't exactly a PR masterstroke. The idea was simple: embrace Christianity or face the sword. In practice, though, it was about as subtle as a marching band at a library. This approach was brutal and effective in the short term, but it didn't win hearts and minds. Charlemagne's insistence on religious conformity as a tool of conquest left a legacy that was as bloody as it was lasting. Logistically, the Saxon Wars were a nightmare. Imagine trying to feed, clothe, and arm an army in an era when roads were more like suggestions and supplies had to be carted over land so treacherous it might as well have been designed by a sadistic game show host. Charlemagne's armies didn't have the luxury of a 24/7 Amazon delivery service. They relied on local foraging and requisitioning, which often meant taking what they needed from the very people they were trying to subdue. It's safe to say the locals weren't rolling out the welcome mats. Economically, these campaigns were draining. Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't just about who had the bigger sword, it was about who could outlast the other financially. Charlemagne had to keep the coffers full, which meant squeezing taxes from his various territories. It's a wonder he didn't have to invent medieval accounting software to keep track of it all. These funds supported not just the soldiers, but also the elaborate system of fortifications he built to keep the Saxons in check. A network of defences that would put any modern city planner to shame. Yet, despite the grueling nature of these campaigns, Charlemagne's military machine was remarkably efficient for its time. He was a skilled strategist, and his ability to rally and motivate his troops was legendary. Charlemagne knew that in the chaos of medieval warfare, adaptability was key. He wasn't afraid to change tactics, whether that meant negotiating temporary peace or unleashing the full might of his forces when diplomacy failed. The Saxon Wars also highlight a fascinating aspect of Charlemagne's rule, his ability to integrate conquered peoples into his empire. For all the bloodshed, he was a pragmatic ruler at heart, understanding that a stable empire was one where former enemies could become allies. Once subdued, Saxon leaders were often brought into the Frankish fold, given lands and titles in exchange for their loyalty. It was a calculated move that helped to cement his control over the vast expanse of his realm. But let's not gloss over the darker side of this integration. For the Saxons, conversion wasn't just a spiritual choice, it was a political necessity. The so-called capitulatio de partibus Saxoniae decreed death for those who refused baptism. It's a chilling reminder of the harsh realities of medieval rule, where faith and politics were inseparably intertwined. Charlemagne's vision of a Christian Europe was as much about power as it was about piety. By the end of the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne had reshaped the political landscape of Europe, but at a significant human cost. The wars had left deep scars, not just on the land, but on the collective memory of the people. The Saxons might have been subdued, but their spirit was far from broken. The resilience of these so-called barbarians against the might of the Carolingian Empire is a testament to the complex interplay of power, culture, and identity in medieval Europe. So what can we take away from Charlemagne's military endeavours? For one, they weren't just about expanding borders, they were about creating a new order. Charlemagne's ambition was to forge a legacy that would endure long after the last sword was sheathed. He was as much a statesman as he was a warrior, and his campaigns reflect the dual nature of his rule, relentless in pursuit of his goals, yet strategic enough to know when to wield the olive branch instead of the sword. In the end, the Saxon wars were a crucible that tested the limits of Charlemagne's military and administrative genius. They were a testament to the sheer force of will required to build an empire in a world where nothing was certain and everything was contested. And while we might marvel at his achievements, it's essential to remember the cost at which they came, a cost measured not just in coin and land, but in human lives and cultural upheaval. As we continue to unravel the legacy of Charlemagne, it's clear that his story is far from finished, and his impact on history is as complex and multifaceted as the man himself. As Charlemagne expanded his empire through the muddy chaos of the Saxon wars, he wasn't just swinging swords and conquering lands. Oh no, he had grander visions, visions that would make even the most hardened warrior scratch his helmet in bewilderment. You see, Charlemagne wanted to do more than rule, he wanted to enlighten. He was a ruler with a penchant for books in a time when literacy was about as common as unicorn sightings. This wasn't your typical medieval ruler swagger. Charlemagne had an ambitious plan to educate his empire. But how do you teach the ABCs to nobles whose idea of letters involved more swordplay than scribing? Meet the Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual revival that Charlemagne championed like an over-enthusiastic school principal. While the term Renaissance might conjure images of Leonardo and Michelangelo, this was more about getting the basics right, like literacy and numeracy. Charlemagne believed that a well-run empire needed educated administrators, not just muscle-bound warriors. It was a revolutionary concept, the pen mightier than the sword. But in this case, the pen had to dodge the occasional swinging axe. Charlemagne's passion for education wasn't just about creating a well-oiled bureaucratic machine, it was a personal mission. Despite his fame, he himself was not fully literate. Charlemagne could speak multiple languages, but reading and writing? That was a different ballgame. It said he kept wax tablets under his pillow, practicing his letters at night. This image of a king fumbling with his ABCs is both endearing and a testament to his desire for self-improvement. It's like watching a CEO try to code. The effort is almost more impressive than the result. To kickstart his educational reforms, Charlemagne recruited the best minds of the time, including Alcuin of York, a scholar whose brainpower was matched only by the magnificence of his beard. Alcuin was tasked with setting up schools, not just for the children of nobles, but for anyone with a pulse and a curiosity for learning. These schools were often attached to monasteries, the intellectual powerhouses of the era, and became the incubators for Charlemagne's new educated elite. But let's not kid ourselves. Teaching literacy to medieval nobles was like herding cats. These were men who'd spent their lives perfecting their swordplay, not their script. Persuading them to swap a sword for a stylus was akin to asking a rock star to trade in their guitar for a spreadsheet. It was a hard sell, but Charlemagne was nothing if not persistent. His efforts laid the groundwork for what would become the medieval curriculum, focusing on the trivium and quadrivium. Think grammar, rhetoric, logic, and a splash of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Yet, this educational push was more than just an intellectual exercise. It was a strategic move to unify his vast and diverse empire. By promoting literacy and learning, Charlemagne aimed to create a shared cultural identity, a way to bind his territories together beyond the mere threat of a sword. It was a clever play, one that recognized the power of ideas to forge unity where force alone could not. And let's talk numbers, because numbers don't lie. During Charlemagne's reign, the number of scriptoria, those medieval writing rooms buzzing with the sound of quills scratching parchment, increased significantly. Manuscript production soared, and while we don't have precise figures, estimates suggest that hundreds of texts were copied and disseminated throughout the empire. This wasn't just an educational initiative, it was a cultural transformation. The Carolingian minuscule, a script developed during this period, became the basis for modern European writing. Who would have thought that a medieval king with a penchant for literacy could leave such a lasting mark on the written word? Economically, Charlemagne's educational reforms had ripple effects. A more educated populace meant better administration, which translated into more efficient tax collection. A win-win for a ruler, always on the lookout for ways to fill the imperial coffers. It's a classic case of investing in human capital long before economists gave it a fancy name. By improving literacy, Charlemagne wasn't just enlightening minds, he was ensuring the smooth operation of his empire. Politically, this move was a masterstroke. Education became a tool of power, a way to instill loyalty and reinforce the Carolingian brand of leadership. Charlemagne's nobles were no longer just warriors. They were part of a new ruling class, literate and capable of managing the complex machinery of empire. This shift in power dynamics was subtle but profound, altering the balance between the sword and the pen in favour of the latter. Yet, for all the genuine progress, there was a darkly comic side to this intellectual renaissance. Picture nobles hunched over desks, quills in hand, trying to make sense of Latin conjugations while their armour clinked with every frustrated sigh. It was a scene ripe for parody, and you can imagine the grumbling, "We conquered this land with swords, not syllables." But Charlemagne wasn't deterred. He understood that the future of his empire depended on more than brute force, and so, through a mix of encouragement, coercion, and sheer royal willpower, Charlemagne's vision of an educated elite slowly came into focus. By the end of his reign, the seeds of a cultural revival had been firmly planted, setting the stage for the intellectual flowering of the High Middle Ages. It's a testament to Charlemagne's foresight that his educational reforms outlived him, influencing generations long after his empire had faded into history. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Charlemagne's story doesn't end here. His empire was a work in progress, a living experiment in governance, culture, and power. As we delve deeper into his reign, we'll see how these educational efforts intertwined with his political ambitions, shaping the course of European history in ways both grand and unexpected. So stay tuned, because Charlemagne's legacy is a tapestry still being woven, and the next chapters promise to be as compelling as the last. Charlemagne's story is far from over, and as we venture into his relationship with the Church, things get as politically tangled as a medieval soap opera. You see, Charlemagne wasn't just conquering lands and spreading literacy, he was also cozying up to the Church like a cat curling up by the hearth. And why not? The Church was the era's spiritual and political powerhouse, holding sway over the souls of Europe with an iron crozier. Now, let's set the scene for the grand drama of 800 AD, when Charlemagne found himself unexpectedly crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. This wasn't just an ordinary Sunday at church. It was a political spectacle with more layers than a millefeuille pastry. The date was December 25th, the year was 800, and the place was Saxon, Peter's Basilica in Rome, because if you're going to stage a coronation, you might as well do it in style. But here's the kicker. Charlemagne allegedly had no idea this was going to happen. Pope Leo III, ever the shrewd operator, pulled a fast one on him. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Leo popped a crown on his head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. Talk about a surprise gift. You can imagine Charlemagne's internal monologue, "Merry Christmas to me, I guess?" The political implications of this move were seismic. By crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo III effectively revived the Western Roman Empire, a title that had been vacant since 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus had his imperial toga unceremoniously yanked. It was a bold move by Leo, one that signalled to the world that the Church held the power to make emperors out of kings. It was also a strategic play to ensure the Pope's own safety and authority after a tumultuous period of rebellion and threat from Roman nobles who weren't exactly sending him Christmas cards. But let's not get too misty-eyed about this imperial rebirth. The coronation was as much a political manoeuvre as it was a divine endorsement. Charlemagne's new title came with a whole host of challenges, not least of which was keeping the Byzantine Empire from throwing a royal tantrum. You see, the Byzantines, ruling from Constantinople, considered themselves the rightful heirs of the Roman legacy. Charlemagne's coronation was like a gauntlet thrown at their feet, and they weren't about to let this challenge go unnoticed. In economic terms, the crowning was a masterstroke. As emperor, Charlemagne now commanded not just the Frankish lands, but a pan-European realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. This enhanced his ability to levy taxes and control trade, crucial for maintaining his sprawling empire. It was like hitting the medieval jackpot, but with the added headaches of governance and diplomacy. The Church, of course, had its own reasons for supporting Charlemagne. Leo needed a strong ally in the West, someone who could protect the papacy from its enemies and ensure the church's influence remained untarnished. Charlemagne, with his penchant for education and reform, was the perfect candidate. He was the church's knight in shining armour, though let's be real, the armour was likely a bit tarnished from all that conquest. Yet, for all the grandeur, Charlemagne's new imperial status wasn't without its downsides. For one, it put him in a delicate dance with the papacy, where each step could either strengthen or fracture their alliance. It was a medieval tango of power, where both partners had to be careful not to step on each other's toes. Charlemagne needed the church's blessing to legitimize his rule, but he also knew that too much papal influence could undermine his authority. The coronation also spurred a flurry of administrative changes. As emperor, Charlemagne embarked on a campaign to reorganize his empire, a task that required more brainpower than brawn. He divided his realm into counties and appointed counts to oversee them. Think of them as medieval CEOs, but with fewer perks and more battles. These counts were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring the emperor's decrees were followed. It was a system that required constant vigilance, as loyalty was a fickle thing in the Middle Ages. And let's not forget the cultural ramifications. Charlemagne's coronation didn't just revive the Roman title, it heralded a new era of Christendom, a concept that sought to unite Europe under a single Christian ruler. It was an ambitious vision, one that would shape the political and religious landscape of Europe for centuries to come. But it also laid the groundwork for future conflicts, as different rulers and kingdoms vied for supremacy within this new order. So, why does all this matter? Well, Charlemagne's coronation marked a turning point in the relationship between church and state, a dynamic that continues to influence modern politics. It was a moment where religion and politics intertwined so tightly that one could barely tell where the mitre ended and the crown began. It was a reminder that power, like history, is often a tale of unintended consequences. Charlemagne's imperial title also reflected the complex nature of his reign, a blend of ambition, diplomacy, and sheer willpower. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics was as impressive as his military conquests. He was a ruler who understood that power wasn't just about wielding a sword. It was about forging alliances, both earthly and divine. But let's not pretend that Charlemagne's empire was a utopia. The challenges he faced were as real as the crown on his head. As emperor, he had to balance the demands of his diverse territories, each with its own unique set of problems. From rebellious nobles to restive Saxons, his reign was a constant juggling act, one that required both finesse and force. In the end, Charlemagne's coronation was more than just a ceremonial event. It was a bold statement about the nature of power and the role of the church in medieval society. It was a testament to the enduring influence of Rome and the ambition of a Frankish king who dared to dream of a united Christendom. As we continue to explore his legacy, it's clear that Charlemagne's story is one of complexity and contradiction, a tale that continues to resonate in the corridors of history. And as we move forward, the next chapters promise to delve even deeper into the intricacies of his rule, revealing a portrait of a leader who was both a product and a shaper of his time. So hold tight, because Charlemagne's empire is far from finished, and the best is yet to come. As we delve into Charlemagne's legacy, it's fitting to remember that history is a tapestry woven with threads of both triumph and tragedy. Charlemagne's empire, though magnificent in scope, was as fragile as a house of cards in a windstorm. His reign, often romanticized as a golden age, was in reality a complex mix of visionary leadership and gritty challenges. The myth of Charlemagne as the unifier of Europe is tantalizing, but let's not get carried away by the grandeur of the legend without peeking under the royal robes. Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Danube River, covering modern-day France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. It was a remarkable feat, especially considering the logistical nightmare of ruling over such a vast territory in the 9th century. But here's the catch. Holding this patchwork of cultures and languages together was akin to herding cats through a medieval marketplace. Charlemagne's centralized rule depended heavily on the loyalty of local counts and nobles who were more interested in feathering their own nests than in the imperial ideal. The cracks in this imperial facade became glaringly apparent after Charlemagne's death in 814. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited a realm ripe for fragmentation. While Charlemagne had been a master of both the sword and the pen, Louis was more of a monk than a monarch. He lacked his father's charisma and political acumen, which is a polite way of saying he couldn't hold a candle to Charlemagne's formidable shadow. Louis's reign was plagued by internal strife, as his sons squabbled over the empire like seagulls fighting over a single French fry. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire was officially split into 3 kingdoms, each ruled by one of Louis's sons. This division was supposed to ensure peace, but it was about as stable as a chocolate teapot. Charles the Bald got the western part, modern-day France. Louis the German took the eastern lands, Germany, and Lothair claimed the middle section, which included the imperial title and the juicy bits like the Rhineland and northern Italy. It was a division that sowed the seeds for centuries of European conflict, a gift that kept on giving. Economically, the splitting of the empire was a disaster. Trade routes that had flourished under Charlemagne's unified realm became fragmented, and local economies struggled to adapt. The Carolingian currency, once a symbol of stability, now faced the medieval equivalent of inflation as each new ruler minted their own coins. It was a monetary free-for-all, and the common folk bore the brunt of this economic chaos. But let's not paint the entire post-Charlemagne period as doom and gloom. The cultural and educational reforms he initiated had lasting impacts. The Carolingian Renaissance laid the groundwork for intellectual revival, and the scriptoria he established continued producing manuscripts that preserved classical knowledge. It's a testament to the power of ideas that, even as political structures crumbled, the seeds of learning continued to flourish. Charlemagne's legacy is also a study in political irony. His grand vision of a united Christendom inadvertently set the stage for future European chaos. The very concept of a unified empire inspired later rulers to pursue similar dreams, often with disastrous consequences. The Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would linger awkwardly for another millennium, was a direct descendant of Charlemagne's ambitions. Its leaders claimed to be the rightful successors to his legacy, even if their grasp on power was more symbolic than substantive. And then there's the legend of Charlemagne himself. Over time, the man became myth, his exploits exaggerated in tales that bordered on the fantastical. Songs and stories transformed him into a larger-than-life figure, a medieval superhero who could do no wrong. The epic Song of Roland, for example, depicted Charlemagne as a wise and just ruler, glossing over the less glamorous aspects of his reign. This mythos served a purpose, reinforcing the idea of a divinely sanctioned ruler at a time when such narratives were politically convenient. But let's face it, Charlemagne was no saint. His reign was marked by brutal campaigns and forced conversions, actions that would make even the most ruthless Game of Thrones character blush. His convert-or-die policy with the Saxons was not just morally questionable, it was a public relations disaster. Yet, history has a way of smoothing out these rough edges, leaving us with a sanitized version of events that often bears little resemblance to reality. So, what do we make of Charlemagne's legacy today? It's a complex tapestry of power, ambition, and unintended consequences. His vision of a united Europe under a single Christian ruler was both audacious and flawed, a dream that inspired as much as it divided. The empire he built was a masterpiece of medieval statecraft, yet its unravelling was a reminder that even the most carefully constructed edifices can crumble under the weight of their contradictions. In the end, Charlemagne's story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. It's a tale of how grand ambitions can lead to unexpected outcomes, of how the pursuit of power can create as many problems as it solves. As we look back on his reign, we're left not just with a portrait of a remarkable leader, but with a reflection on the complexities of human nature and the enduring allure of myth-making. And so, as we close the book on Charlemagne's empire, let's remember that the real story is always more interesting than the legend. It's a story of a man who dared to dream big, who tried to shape the world in his image, and whose legacy continues to echo through the corridors of history. Whether we see him as a hero or a conqueror, a visionary or a tyrant, Charlemagne remains a figure of enduring fascination, a reminder that the past is never as distant as it seems.